Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description.
Flames of the Sun God by Grey Nimbus. During the intense 2-year training session with Silver's Rayleigh, Monkey D. Luffy and his mentor make a discovery that will push Luffy's training to an entirely new level. The Dark King braces himself wary as he begins to turn the Straw Hat Captain into the world's most ridiculous powerhouse. OP Luffy, OOC Luffy, Early DF Awaken Luffy. Big shout out to all the warlords of this channel. You know who you are. Want to stand among legends? Join the channel membership and show your support. Adios.
Chapter 6 Katakuri almost wished he could drop his calm, collected demeanor enough that he could pace without being looked at sideways. He stood at the docks where the foot soldiers were preparing for the arrival of the Thousand Sunny and their escort, ignoring any attempts at conversation and the annoying catcalling from his older siblings whenever they passed by. He'd managed to escape from his mother a few hours ago, cursing the fact that she'd only now deigned to tell him about her plans for the Vinsmokes, and right before his would-be fiancé arrived as well. A plan he had a few misgivings about, at that. Kill them all? The Vinsmokes? Katakuri repeated, admirably managing to keep his voice at dull surprise. Instead of strangled disbelief, or worse, complete incredulity, he looked up at his mother, ignoring the tea and snacks on his plate, tempting him. Mother. Bah. I can hear you thinking, Katakuri. Big Mom waved flippantly before seizing another pastry. The muffin screamed and quailed in fear the entire way into her mouth before death cut it off. Vinsmoke Sanji will be tranquilized and spared from the slaughter. That should keep your little fiancé happy. Which? It might, but Katakuri suspected that would depend entirely on what sort of relationship the fourth prince had with his birth family. He'd watched the entirety of the execution broadcast. Mama had insisted on it, staring burning holes in their transponder snail from the instant the 2nd Division commander had been named Roger's blood son. He'd seen Straw Hat vault across a not insignificant distance in an instant to put herself between Crocodile and Whitebeard when the former warlord went to attack him. Her reasoning for interfering with a man who would not underestimate her a second time. Portgas liked him, so she would defend an old man she'd never met and owed nothing to with her life. Newgate hadn't been in any real danger, but the principle of the matter had been enough for her. If Vinsmoke felt anything for his estranged family, he'd only have to say the word and Katakuri would bet she'd take the same tact here. Damn the fact she was in the dead center of Totland and defying Charlotte Linlin herself. But he also knew that this observation wouldn't sway his mother in the slightest, so he kept it to himself. Instead he asked, I'm curious as to why you feel the exertion is necessary. The Germa Kingdom will be giving you access to their technology through the marriage, will they not? Big Mom's smirk collapsed into an ugly snarl, her brow pulled tightly in offense. That little man presumes to use me to get his pretty crown back, she said darkly. Her hand clenches the arm of her chair until it cracked, whining under the strain. Why do you think he's here, Katakuri? That he shares my vision. That he wishes to create the world of equality and harmony. No, he wants to use my forces and my children to make himself another petty tyrant. Katakuri leaned back subtly. He could feel the pressure of the room increase as his mother's haki began leaking out. No, Big Mom said, exhaling in aggravation before retreating into a calm facade. I will take what I want from his labs and destroy the excess baggage. For that, I will need you to preform as ever, Katakuri. He nodded, doing his level best to dismiss his misgivings. He had plenty of experience with that. As you wish, Mother. Your fiancé will be here soon, Big Mom said, before an aggravated look crossed her face. You will need to convince her that marrying you is what she desires most. I'm sorry? Katakuri asked, caught off guard. Had he heard that correctly? His mother ignored him, muttering to herself. That brat is lucky that she's the rarest creature on the oceans, a goddess made flesh. How dare she show me that kind of cheek after the trouble she's given me, when I'm offering her one of my sons and a place in my family. Dates and romancing. She'll agree to this one way or another, but I'll need to get a few doses of that. Mother. Big Mom's eyes snapped over to her strongest child, who admirably didn't flinch under her infuriated expression. The girl seeks to be pursued by you, she said, her voice slow and heavy like she was speaking to a child. I have granted her 2 weeks to be convinced before the marriage. You will woo her in that time frame and you will ensure she will have no other man. Katakuri opened his mouth to say something, thought the better of it at the last second, closed it and nodded in perfect obedience. The sweet commander stared blandly out at the ocean waters, wondering not for the first time what cosmic joke was being made at his expense. His mother had been a little erratic ever since Nika appeared 2 years ago, and this was the result. She would have him woo Monkey D. Luffy? How? With his face? Katakuri was a soldier, and kept everyone outside of his family at a clear remove. This was one of the few areas that he not only didn't excel at, but had no experience in whatsoever. Wasn't this why Pudding had been selected as Vinsmoke's bride? She was young, beautiful, brilliant and broken, ruthless. Katakuri was out of his element here and he knew it. He could hardly look at his mother's many relationships for support. You couldn't call those flings, at best marriages. He'd never been approached by women or men with anything but slavishly devoted servants, screaming fans, or both. There was a critical difference between romantic and familial love, and the latter served as the only significant relationships he had. Yet he must romance a young wild woman and convince this goddess, who adored freedom and gladly fought the world for it, to bind herself to him and his mother. Him. A beast who deliberately constructed the facade of an unbreakable monster? No, his only hope for any chance at succeeding, or decent advice, would be speaking with Praline or Chiffon. If she would suffer him being in her presence, otherwise he was a ship without a rudder headed straight for the calm belt. Katakuri breathed in deeply, silently commanding himself to get a grip. When he managed to clear the noise from his head, he closed his eyes for a moment and focused his observation haki, looking into the future. Monkey D. Luffy stood at the top of the cake, wearing a stunning dress that turned her from a scruffy pirate into a sensual goddess. He stood in front of her, to the right of Vinsmoke and Pudding, and his heart was twisting up in a tortured knot. The desire to not be here, to not be doing this, thrummed alongside his pulse, bitter reluctance tasting like ashes in his mouth, and Pudding's hands were shaking. Visibly shaking, like the world had been yanked out from under her, and she couldn't hold on to the gun mother had given her. I do. Do you mean it? Luffy asked, cutting off the priest who had never once in his life been interrupted, leaving him gawking at her, stuttering as he tried to derail the ceremony. Are you sure? Her gaze isn't mocking or accusatory. She tilted her head to the side, her eyes, almost entreating, demanding the truth from him instead of the words his mother had given him and I don't want to take your freedom from you, Luffy said earnestly, tilting her chin up and smiling at him. Do you really want to marry me? The sound of the whistle brought Katakuri out of the vision with a start. His heart jolted violently in his chest, his mind rushing over the scene as he tried to make sense out of it. The further ahead he saw something, the less information he had to go off of, and that. What was that? What was that strange scene? She must have discovered his mother's plans, but if she had, why wasn't she furious as she had been that day in Marineford? And how had she learned of it? And freedom? Freedom from what? He was a sweet commander of Emperor Charlotte Linlin, one of the few pirates who could go and do whatever he pleased even if he were to act on the darkest and bloodiest desires of sapient kind. In what way was he not free? He was a Charlotte free of that. Katakuri's head throbbed, and it was a moment before he focused on the approaching Germa warship sailing side and side with the familiar figure of the Thousand Sunny. His breath came out in a deep, husky growl. Around him the dock preparations pick up in intensity. Excited babbling echoing from all the foot soldiers and passing civilians. So she is coming, I hadn't been sure she would. A goddess is coming to Totland. Oh, I hope the city looks good. What will her crew want for accommodations? Do we have everything I put on that list? Ah, I can't believe General Katakuri is finally getting married. I'm so jealous of her. Katakuri waited patiently as the two ships came in, wondering for the first time if perhaps he should have relented and allowed at least a few of his siblings to accompany him as a welcoming party. Flampe's behavior after the original announcement, throwing knives at Luffy's wanted poster, apparently among other things, had him decide to go alone. He couldn't figure out why exactly his younger sisters, she wasn't the only one, had taken it so personally. Their possessiveness of him was familiar, but this wasn't. As the Sunny came into dock, a semi-familiar raven-haired figure ran up to the railing of the ship and leaned over it. When her eyes landed on him, she beamed and launched herself from the deck down to the wooden dock, and trotted up to him, her hand adjusting her worn straw hat. Monkey D. Luffy came up to about an arm's length away from him and peered curiously up at him. "Are you Cat?" she asked brightly, casually. Her hazel eyes are, surprisingly doe-like, Katakuri noted. The boy's clothes she's wearing aren't particularly flattering, yet it can't the fact that she's beautiful, in a sweet and soft sort of way. She's slender and, strangely small seeming, standing in front of him. It's a startlingly disarming first impression, almost jarring against the powerful figure he remembered from the visual den 2 years ago. Cat, he repeated flatly, confused. MMMHMM. Luffy nodded energetically. He's the guy Big Mom would like me to marry. She looked around. He'd at least come to welcome me here, wouldn't he? Cat. Was that supposed to be a nickname? A pet name? My name is Katakuri, he said after a confused second. Luffy refocused on him instantly, and she brightened. Oh, it is you. Whoa. She looked up at him, a little awe in her eyes. You're really tall. Her legs stretched lightly, raising her up until she's at eye level with him. She. Hi. We're finally together in the same place. Katakuri blinked rapidly at her. He didn't like laughter. He solely associated it with mockery, or his mother finding amusement in something warped or disturbing. And yet, Luffy's carefree laugh washes over him like a gentle wave lapping against the beach. So we are, he said in a neutral tone. The Thousand Sunnies plank dropped, admitting the girl's navigator, pet, musician, and a pair of minks. Nice to meet you, Luffy said, snapping back to her normal height. Hey, can you tell me why Big Mom was the one who wrote the proposal instead of you? What? Katakuri uttered, blindsided. Luffy tilted her head. You didn't write it yourself, she said. You didn't even write me a poem or something nice like that. Well, of course he didn't. He wouldn't know where to start. He hasn't written any poetry in his life. Why? I have little talent in writing, I'm afraid. Katakuri responded, refusing to show her how off guard he is. I'm a warrior, not a scholar. I had hoped my mother would speak for me. I apologize if it lacked romanticism. Luffy peered up at his face, studying him intently. Then she seemed to accept this and nodded her head. She did, and thanks. It was kinda dry, she said, blissfully oblivious to the fact that giving her a loving husband was not a concern of Linlin's. Though I don't know if I wanted to get married yet. Gramps always said that I couldn't marry a man I just met, I had to know them well. She was serious. Davy Jones below, she was serious. She really had told his mother that she'd reject the marriage if he couldn't make her fall in love with him, then waltzed right into Totland without any concern for a trap being laid for her. She was mad as Gall D. Roger. So Cat, Luffy said before Katakuri could say something very dry. I was hoping we could go on some dates. She clapped her hands together. I was thinking about going out for lunch, some nice long walks, or maybe seeing a play. I have no objections to that, Katakuri managed after a second of stunned silence. Luffy relaxed, looking pleased. That's great. She turned around and cheerfully waved at her crew, who were warily approaching with the 2 Vinsmokes at her heels. Winch Green was glaring daggers at him, which made Katakuri arch an eyebrow. The prince opened his mouth to say something, only for his sister to ram her elbow into his side and smile apologetically at him. Hey guys, come and say hello. This is Cat, Luffy yelled, not noticing the interaction. Katakuri, the man corrected her, wondering if his name was really that hard for her to pronounce. Cat Burglar Nami, Soul King Brook, and Cotton Candy Lover Tony Chopper, correct. The reindeer zone flailed, visibly aggravated. Those stupid Marines. He met Katakuri's eyes with surprising boldness and said, yes, that's us, but I'm not the crew pet. I'm the doctor. It was a sign of how offended the pet designation made him that Chopper was able to yell at a man he was, understandably, somewhat terrified of. Doctor, then. Katakuri corrected himself without breaking stride. Mother welcomes you to Totland. The foot soldiers will show you to your accommodations for the duration of your stay. Identify any luggage you wish to bring with you. Mother will greet you personally tomorrow. Nami blanched and immediately plastered a pleasant, grateful smile on her face. Luffy looked about and murmured, "Hey, where's?" only to be stopped when Nami stepped on her foot. "Marvelous, I was going to have trouble carrying my wardrobe chests without those two lumoxes to act as my mules," she said cheerfully. "Are these the soldiers?" She waved at the dock hands. Katakuri nodded fractionally. Nami immediately turned and began barking orders, giving clear instructions about what they could or could not touch and what doors they weren't to open. The men quailed under her light-hearted malice and hastened to obey her. He turned his attention back to Luffy, whose smile has vanished as she looked around. "Is something the matter?" he asked. Luffy looked up at him and put her hands on her hips. "Where's Sanji?" she demanded. "Where's my cook? One of your minions kidnapped him at gunpoint. I'm still mad about that. I want to see him. He better not be hurt." "Ah, of course." Silently Katakuri cursed Bej for leaving him to deal with the results of acquiring the blonde, and vowed to make life unpleasant for him in the near future. "Vinsmoke Sanji is present and unharmed," he said, and because something about the frown on her face was bothering him, he continued, "Unless I miss my guess, he's currently with his father in the Germa castle. If Princess Reiju would escort us there, you can see him immediately." Reiju nodded, an odd look in her eye. Katakuri reminded himself to search for her in the future later. "Of course," she said lightly, a friendly mask upon her face at once. "Come right this way." Luffy relaxed, relieved, though she didn't smile again. That bothered feeling intensified a little. The castle was worse than Sanji remembered, somehow. Oh, his father was the same bastard he'd always been, claiming they would have an honorable duel, then cowering behind human shields and his raid suit. Only remembered that Sanji existed when he didn't want to give any of the children he cared about to Big Mom's brood. His brothers were the exact same, somehow having not changed one iota even in the little things, like their mannerisms, or they're almost like he'd gone back in time, or maybe gotten trapped in a nightmare. Leaning on the terrace of the castle and looking out over the water, Sanji shivered and clutched his arm. His busies from the so-called duel still hurt, though they would fade soon enough. The black pit of cold despair engulfing him was much worse. He had almost thought that since he'd lived through being under Judge's roof once, he'd be prepared and braced for the grim, bitter reality of living with them again. He'd faced so much worse than that old man since he became a pirate. Whatever he did, he couldn't compare to Kuma separating him from Luffy and his crewmates, a failing. The explosive collars around his wrists glint mockingly in the late afternoon sunlight. What fanciful thinking. It was because he'd found a true family, first with the old geezer, then with his sunshine, that Judge still had the power to hurt him. It was because he knew what love was that this place of misery and exclusion felt like a vice around his soul. Sanji stared numbly at the middle distance. Being outside of the castle helped him avoid his brothers, but he probably shouldn't stay in one place for too long. Ichiji and Yanji were worse when Reiju wasn't around. Property. That's what Judge thought of him, that he'd procured these manacles from his underground contacts for this purpose. Sanji remembered when they broke into the auction house to save Kimi, and seeing the horrible device around her throat. How it had filled him with terrible rage, how he'd wanted to give all of his strength to break the collars off every slave trapped on that foul island. No one in this world is meant to be a slave. Except for him, it seemed. A deep sense of despair rolled over the blonde as he stared down at his wrists, unable to look away from them. The realization, once it had sunk in, was the only thing dominating his mind. The old man was in danger because of him, just because he'd been good to him, had given him a place in his home. What a way for Sanji to repay him for everything, with Judge holding a gun to his head. Sanji breathed out slowly, hoping beyond hope that Germa wasn't targeting any other people, that he hadn't endangered his crewmates' loved ones as well as his own. He would never forgive himself if they got hurt because of him. "Sanji." The voice echoed across the open ground and slammed into Sanji like a bullet. His cigarette falling from his lips, the blonde jerked backward and wheeled around to stare, unable to believe what he was seeing, what his eyes were showing him. "What? No, how could? Why is she here?" Luffy hurtled across the stone ground, leaving Charlotte Katakuri and his sister in her dust as she cleared the distance between them in a second. Sanji instinctively dropped his arms to catch her a second before she crashed into him. Long practice with his captain meant he wasn't thrown off his feet thanks to dropping into a bracing stance. The impact still sent him skidding several feet backward, his heels digging grooves into the stone until he came to a stop. "Sanji, I finally caught up with you," Luffy cried in relief, wrapping her arms around him several times. What are you doing here?" Sanji demanded in a panic, putting his hands on her shoulders. His heart throbbed violently at this sudden, horrifying shift in his circumstances, not her arrival, but what it meant. She's out here in plain view of both Germa and Big Mom's hulking, powerful son, who looked very much like he'd been escorting her. Images of the Sunny being attacked and captured in his absence fill his mind, and his stomach drops into his feet. "Are you hurt?" Luffy asked, ignoring him. She pulled back a little, not loosening her hold on him in the slightest, keeping him almost pinned against her. In any other situation Sanji would be completely melting at being wrapped in her embrace. But the sheer depths of his despair and panic overrode even that impulse. "Did Big hurt you? I'm going to break his face." "I'm fine," Sanji retorted, pushing on her shoulders. "Why are you here? What happened after I left Zou?" Luffy looked him up and down once, then looked up to meet his gaze. "Oh, Big Mom invited me," she responded, the simple statement briefly making Sanji stop breathing in sheer horror. "But you're really okay? They haven't been keeping you prisoner? They've been feeding you?" Her big hazel eyes stab into him, searching for any sign of dishonesty. The blonde's jaw worked helplessly for a few moments before he could get his mental footing back under him. "I've been fine," he lied blatantly because holy shit, that was not remotely the thing that matters right now. "Son, Captain, you shouldn't be here. What are you doing?" Why hadn't she abandoned him? Why risk everything for a failure? Luffy shook her head slightly. "Weren't you told?" she asked, bemused. "Big Mom wants me to marry Cat back there." She briefly retracted one arm in order to wave vaguely back at Charlotte goddamn Katakuri. Sanji's airway closed up completely. "You, Mary?" he repeated, desperately hoping he'd heard her wrong. But the first time he'd had this feeling, he hadn't been that lucky. Sanji was genuinely impressed that Vivi had managed to catch Luffy before she could go running off the Mary before they disembarked from Nanohana. None of them had managed that yet, and they had been traveling with their captain for longer. He's also grateful for it. The deserts of Alabasta, as beautiful and vibrant as they are brutal in their heat. The rest of the crew would need plenty of food and water to travel through it, but with how much his captain ate on a regular basis, Sanji suspected it would be much harder on her. He wouldn't allow it. He had meal and ration plans drawn up before they'd left Drum Island for this eventuality. Of course, his task would be much harder if she went running off into the desert and left them all in her dust. Luffy was rather sulky as Vivi led her down the streets of Nanohana by the hand, refusing to let go and potentially let the Ravenet out of her sight. Despite being the same age, the dynamic was almost like a mother with her overly energetic daughter. Or perhaps a responsible older sibling trying to manage her wilder little sister. Sanji adored watching them together, and he so admired that motherly, queenly strength that Vivi had. "Look, we'll go to the restaurant and get some food for you," Vivi said placatingly. "There's one at the end of the road." Luffy perked up a little bit at that. "Oh no," Sanji said, immediately reaching out to try and anchor Vivi before his captain could rush off with her. "Luffy, why?" His hand just missed her sleeve before Luffy cheered excitedly and bolted forward, hauling a shrieking Vivi along in her wake. Sanji cursed his slow reaction time and put on the gas, belatedly wishing he hadn't stuck Chopper and Zoro with the grocery shopping in his rush to act as the girls' bodyguards. He ran as fast as he could down the road after them. Luffy busted through the doors of the restaurant, but, cognizant of the fact that she was carrying Vivi, she skidded to a halt a few feet after doing so and carefully placed the princess on her feet rather than blindly barrel right up to the doorway. Though she still ended up slamming into Smoker's back, sending him sprawling across the length of the building. Sanji stumbled through the doorway just in time to see this, and groaned in despair. "Of course," he muttered. "Of course he followed us here." He was about to raise his voice to warn Luffy when someone else cut across him. "Luffy," a deep male voice said, warm with emotion. Sanji froze in place, orienting the voice to a gorgeous, muscular young man who was sitting at the bar. He wore dark shorts, light shoes and an orange cowboy hat. His tousled black hair framed a youthful face and bright ocean green eyes. He looked like he could have stepped out of a romance novel, and he recognizes his captain. "Luffy, is that you?" Luffy blinked out of her food haze at the voice. Sanji had never stared for half a second, then gasped in joy. Ace? Ace. She ran across the room. The young man vaulted out of his chair and caught her when she crashed into him, spinning her in a circle as she laughed joyfully, her hat falling down her back by its strain. Sanji froze, staring at the tableau with wide eyes along with Vivi, though his reasons were very different from hers. Who was this man, holding his sunshine like that? White-hot jealousy lanced through him, and the desire to kick the man's head off is incredibly strong. Luffy buried her face in his bare chest when her feet touched the ground again, humming happily. The intimate gesture stuck an ice pick in Sanji's chest. Ace, I've missed you so much, she babbled happily. What are you doing here? I was looking for you, Ace responded, and then he kissed the top of her head. Didn't you get my message, a drum? Luffy peered up at him. Ace chuckled, looking down at her with a mixture of amusement and adoration. Still a little ditzy, I see, he said teasingly, making Sanji both want to hit him more and feel something akin to fear. Luffy pouted at him in response. Achi. Why, you know this person, Luffy? Vivi said, staring at the large tattoo inked across Ace's back. Their captain blinked and glanced sideways at them before beaming. Guys, this is Ace, he's my big brother, we grew up together, she said happily. Sanji looked up at Ace, saw the way he twitched a little and the flicker of emotion that passed through his ocean eyes when she said, Big brother. He had seen hundreds of couples pass through the Bharati, how they would look at each other as if they were the only thing that existed in the world. Luffy. A big brother doesn't look at you like that. Sanji blinked the memory away, swallowing hard as he experienced that feeling of defeat for the second time. You're getting married? Into Big Mom's family? He repeated dully, silently pleading for her to say no. Luffy wrinkled her nose. I haven't decided if I am yet, she responded. But Sanji, what about you? Do you like Miss Pudding? Do you want to marry her? Her hazel eyes are wide with concern, drilling into him, like she's afraid of what he's going to say. Sanji forced himself to think through the haze in his mind. She's a very kind girl, she's wonderful really, but my choice doesn't matter. If I don't do this they'll kill Zeph and the staff at the Bharati. Luffy, I love you. How could I promise to marry a kind, sweet woman when I'm in love with you? Luffy is looking at him in concern. Sanji is never this inarticulate around him. Backing up a little, her arms slid down from his shoulders down to his wrists to hold his hands. And was stopped by cold metal. Luffy blinked. And looked down at the explosive cuffs. She went very, very still. Sanji felt tears burn at the corners of his eyes. It took all his discipline to force them back in. He hadn't wanted her to see him like this. Now she's seen him chained and collared like a dog. Humiliation and self-loathing pooled in his gut. Luffy stared in silence for a moment. Then she looked up and Sanji flinched in shock to see her eyes had turned the brilliant, hard gold of her Nika form. Luffy didn't recognize the cuffs right away. It took her a few seconds, but the knee-jerk feeling of wrong was instant. Then she felt an explosion of outrage from the presence of Nika at the back of her mind. And she suddenly remembered Kami and the human auction house, and it slotted into place. It was a slave collar. There was a bomb on his wrists, which could be detonated on a whim and take away his precious hands. There were slave collars on Sanji's wrists. Bomb collars on Sanji's wrists. Someone had put slave collars on her. Sanji. Who did this? She asked flatly. What? Sanji asked hesitantly. Who put these on you? Luffy repeated slowly, rage boiling up in her until she felt like her body couldn't contain it. Sanji was staring wide-eyed at her, and she tried to rein in her haki just in case he was getting buffeted by it. Her whole body was on fire, demanding that this heinous offense was punished and undone immediately. Father did, Reiju interjected, causing Sanji to snap his head up and look at her in shock. He felt that they were necessary, and wouldn't hear otherwise. What? You objected to? Sanji started, only to cut himself off when Luffy dropped his wrists, turned on one heel, and started walking up to the castle. Luffy. Oi, she said, silencing him immediately. Your father's in there somewhere, right? I gotta talk to him for a minute. Chapter 7. Luffy stormed through the halls of Germa Castle, Gear 5 buzzing right beneath her skin. The power was hot, pulsing like a heartbeat. begging to be unleashed in all its glory. She coiled it around herself like a long coat so it wouldn't spill out on the servants who scrambled to get out of her way or the dumb weak soldiers who tried to stop her at every other door. She slammed their heads into the wall and kept walking, vaguely aware of Sanji hurrying after her and trying to say something she couldn't really hear over the roaring in her ears. She's pretty sure Kat and Reiju were following too, but she hadn't paid enough attention. When was the last time she'd been this filled with rage? Dressrosa, Marineford, Enies Lobby, Alabasta, Kokoyashi? Luffy seethed, unable to get the image of those fucking collars out of her head. Slave collars, on Sanji. She had used Gear 5 sparingly since Marineford. Rayleigh and Shanks and Uncle Ed had all been very clear once she regained consciousness that her body wasn't nearly strong enough, back then, to sustain the immense power of the sun. That she needed to practice a lot more with her haki and to create a gear between 3 and 5, so her would be able to use the power effectively without killing herself in the process. Luffy had listened, and she trained diligently and she came up with Gear 4. She'd only broken out Gear 5 against Mingo when she saw him shoot Trafi when he was already down and badly injured, and on Fishman Island to stop the Noah from crash landing. It stung and hurt, and she's still strengthening herself to take it on fully, but right now none of that mattered. Gear 5 was her peak, there was no need to use it most of the time, not after how hard she'd worked with Rayleigh and Boa. After all, why should she hunt rabbits with a cannon? But right now she wanted to use it and she couldn't resist the urge. If Judge was capable of putting a slave collar on Sanji, how had he treated him before? What had he done to him before he left home for the East Blue? Luffy increased her speed from a deliberate walk to a light jog. She'd been turned around a few times by the castle's winding hallways, but then she'd encountered a sweet lady from the kitchens named Colette who gave her much better directions than any of the foot soldiers, so she's very close now. A minute later and she came up to the massive double doors to the throne room. Luffy let a little more of Gear 5 leak out, swung one leg back, and delivered a violent kick to the door. The wood and stone splintered and flew out of the frame to crash to the floor. Luffy heard a deepish voice cry, "What the hell?" as she walked inside. "Luffy, wait," Sanji protested, catching up with her and putting a hand on her shoulder. Luffy shrugged him off, reminding herself to be gentle, and strode up to the two people who were in the room. The first guy was about Sanji's height, red hair, emotionless posture, and identical to the comic's depiction of sparking red. Luffy kept him in her peripheral vision as she zeroed in on the older man who just jumped up from the throne. The guy was tall, and he carried himself like a king, King Walpole, that is, not Vivi's dad. He dressed in grays and blacks with an orange coat hanging mostly off of one shoulder. She could see flashes of metal and something else in the gaps of his clothes. Some kind of bodysuit? Maybe. He was holding a spear that was at least as long as he was tall, and his face was angular and hard-looking. His eyes weren't blue, but a very dark brown. This guy was Sanji's dad. Luffy couldn't see any trace of her cook in him as he puffed up his chest and stalked toward her, attempting to loom over her. The light that was always in Sanji's eyes isn't there. His passion, his warmth, the way his eyes would gleam when he tried a new recipe and they all loved it. The righteous outrage that burned from him when he saw something that offended his morals. Judge Vinsmoke's eyes were cold, hard and haughty. Every one of the man's muscles seemed to be straining to assert dominance over her. This was Sanji's dad. Impossible. He wasn't even like old man Zeph. She remembered the old cook's fierce brashness, how he loomed and exuded authority without much effort, as clear as if she met him yesterday. Who did this man think he was? How dare you burst into my throne room? Who are you? Why didn't the guards stop you? Judge demanded, clenching his spear. I'm Monkey D. Luffy, Luffy responded. Her voice came out the same way she spoke to Arlong the first time. Are you Judge Vinsmoke? Behind her, Sanji shivered, frozen to the spot. Judge scoffed. And why should I answer some girl who speaks so insolently to me? Ichiji stood up slowly. That's the failures captain, father. The red-haired boy said airily. Luffy twitched violently. Failure. Winch Green had said the same thing. The holder of the human fruit model. Nika. Victor at Marineford. Vinsmoke briefly looked shocked at the statement, then looked down at Luffy with an expression of pure, greedy calculation. Oh? This is the girl they call the Sun Goddess? I hadn't realized she was so young. He hit the butt of his lance against the tiled floor. "Yes, I am the king of Germa, Judge Vinsmoke." "Then you're the one who put slave collars on my Sanji," Luffy said slowly, punching her fist into her open palm. Her eyes began to glow molten gold. "Take them off, now." Vinsmoke blinked twice, then looked up scornfully at her cook, before making a dismissive sound. "I think not. He forgot his place. Those are there to remind him of it." His place? His place? Luffy punched the man square in the nose, shifting fully into Gear 5 so she could apply as much strength to her fist as she could without killing the bastard. The cartilage shattered under her knuckles and Judge went flying backward, crashing through the throne, and wall behind it, and several walls after that. Ichiji jolted in shock and immediately moved to attack her. Luffy nonchalantly bent her body in a crescent moon shape, causing him to go flying past her, then lashed out with one arm to catch him by the leg. Swinging him around like a flail, she bounced sparking red off the pillar and flung him directly after his father. Dropping to the ground to regain balance, Luffy launched herself through the openings in the wall after him. The man met her about halfway, lance at the ready. Luffy wove around his strikes and dodged when he flew up overhead. Ichiji came at her from the side. She snapped one arm up and blackened it with armament, catching his punch without even flinching. Shrinking herself into a small form, she grabbed his arm and darted between his legs, flipping him over 180 degrees so he crashed into the concrete right below his father's attack. Judge cursed and aborted at the last moment, and Luffy swung her leg as a whip and caught him in the stomach, sending him flying down the hallway. "His place?" she bellowed, her voice thundering with a reverberating echo from Nika. Judge crashed halfway through the wall and staggered to his feet, grabbing for his lance. "Sanji's place is at my side, free. He's not your property." Judge glowered, then tapped his foot on the ground. Fire burst from them. There were jets in his boots? Right, he would have the same tech powers as Pink and the others. He's a failure. A weakling. He launched himself at her, and he was fast, sure, but not faster than Mingo or Kizaru. Luffy evaded his strike by jumping over him and spun like a wheel. Gum Gum battle axe. Her heels slammed into the middle of his back and drove him down into the pavement until there was a decent-sized crater in the walkway. Ichiji was back on his feet and attacked her from behind. Luffy felt the impact of his fist and let that area of her body stretch, then snapped back to normal. It tossed the redhead away from her, sending him skidding backwards. Luffy whirled on him. Judge hacked and wheezed as he scrambled to get up. "Niji, Reiju, where are you?" he bellowed as Luffy swung around Ichiji, eagerly frustrated blows. Sanji scrambled to the edge of the broken wall, staring at the scene with wide eyes. A few yards behind him, Reiju staggered and pressed one hand against her chest as the rest of her body immediately began to obey the order. She should have stayed further back, of course he's calling for reinforcements. Her muscles are coiling for a fight and she can't relax, can't work around it, only give herself a throbbing headache. Frantic. "You cannot make me fight to keep slave collars on Sanji. You can't." She looked around and locked eyes with Big Mom's massive, unreadable son. Katakuri stared at the first princess in surprise, because she was moving to obey her father, and yet, something in her expression is. The broths scattered like terrified rodents when he strode out from around the corner. Too bad for them that one of them dropped the scissors they just used to forcibly shear Pudding's bangs, telling him exactly what happened. Rage flared deeply in his chest, and it exploded out of him when his sister looked up at him, humiliated tears spilling from all three eyes. She flung herself at him for a hug, pleading, "You don't think I'm a freak, right? And the brat's punishment is set in stone." Katakuri launched some mochi at Reiju, trapping her feet and legs up to about mid-thigh, arresting her in place. He couldn't explain the impulse, or understand the briefly grateful look the pink-haired woman gave him before it vanished underneath a wry smile. He pushed it all aside and strode forward, eyes fixed on his fiancée as she unleashed pure, divine rage upon her opponents. Luffy grabbed Judge's face in one hand and flung him into the wall, staggering him. She pressed her palm against his forehead and forced her other hand down his throat into his stomach, then blew her fist up like a balloon until she'd stretched the wannabe slaver into a wrecking ball. Gritting her teeth, she spun around and flung him out toward Ichiji. This blow sent the redhead flying off of the terrace to land somewhere in the docks, unconscious. Which is good, because he's not the one she needs to completely destroy at the moment. That could change if he uses the word failure to refer to Sanji again. Gritting her teeth, Luffy began to slam Judge into the ground repeatedly like she was playing whack-a-mole at a festival. Cracking the pavement with his face, Luffy uttered a scream of pure rage before slamming the man into the dirt one more time before dropping him, retracting her fist back with a snap. Judge rolled over, clutching the shaft of his lance. You bitch, he charged her again. Luffy warped her body into a massive, muscular Valkyrie and stopped him by grabbing the weapon. Seething, she then kicked the man in the face to send him flying backward. Sanji is not a slave, she snarled, easily dancing around his follow-up attack. He is not a thing for you to use and discard. Give me the key to those collars before I take them from you. She launched one punch, then another until she was firing a brutal Gatling into the man until she pounded him right into the floor. Her rage flowed freely through every punch, her fists a complete blur for a solid minute before ending the attack with a final slug to the gut that sent Judge crashing a few yards backward to the ground, vomiting. He tried to get up, but collapsed. Luffy blinked, frowning. Was that all he could throw at her? Wasn't this guy supposed to be the king of an evil empire? She waited for him to get up, bouncing in place, but the man just threw up again, spitting out blood. Hissing out a sharp breath, Luffy dismissed Gear 5 and relaxed her muscles. Crouching slightly like a gargoyle, she watched Judge slowly stagger to his feet, silently daring him to try something. His face is bruised and bleeding, his helmet is split apart, his lance got snapped in half at some point during her beatdown of him, and she's at least broken one of his legs judging by the look of it. Mingo was much harder to beat down than that, she thought, bemused. What the heck? Shaking her head, it didn't matter, those bastard world nobles were slavers while also being weak little bastards after all. Luffy strode up to the man. Where's the key? She demanded coldly. Give it to me, now. Judge spat up blood and looked sideways. Katakuri. Help me, he demanded. Why aren't you defending your ally? I don't take orders from you, Katakuri retorted flatly. You're not my in-laws yet. Luffy glanced sideways to see Katakuri and Sanji standing in the opening she'd created in the wall. Her maybe fiancé was standing with his arms crossed and a very unimpressed expression on his face. He was oozing contempt, even with his mouth hidden underneath his scarf. Sanji's expression was full of emotion, blue eyes darting between her and the fallen king. She grinned at Katakuri, pleased and thankful. She'd rather they sparred on their own terms. Returning her attention to Judge, she planted her heel on his chest and forced him onto the ground on his back. Then she started rustling around in the pockets of his coat, checking to see if he was keeping the key on him. Hopefully she hadn't broken it if he did, that would be embarrassing. Fortunately, she was in luck. Searching one of his inside coat pockets caused her fingers to bump into the familiar feeling, to Nika, of a metal key, and she wrenched it out. Making a pleased sound, she stepped off of Judge and walked back toward Sanji. Judge wheezed miserably, rolling onto his side and watching in disbelieving fury as the sun goddess, the crowning jewel of any army, went to the side of the pathetic failure he's forced to call his son. All this over him? He spat out. That brat is nothing. My greatest shame. Luffy whirled around and swung her foot out, kicking him in the face and sending him plunging into unconsciousness. You shut the hell up, she growled, her eyes narrowing. When he didn't get up, she cooled her rage as much as she could before hurrying back toward Sanji. Sanji felt like he was in a dream, a strange and beautiful one. In his entire life with his family, only Reiju had ever stood up for him, and then only in secret. No one had ever stopped the blows that rained down from Ichiji, Niji and Yanji, protested Judge's vicious rejections and abuse. But in his bleakest moment, Luffy had just done all that and more. Luffy ran up to him, a smile of relief replacing her furious expression, and she brandished the key when she came to a stop. I got it, she said. Here, give me your wrist, Sanji. The blonde couldn't speak. If he tried to vocalize what she'd just made him feel, he'd sweep her up in his arms and kiss her right in front of Katakuri. Instead he shakily raised his wrists, briefly looking over her shoulder to where Judge lay in a bloody heap on the ground. Germa's soldiers were rushing to his side. He'd been vanquished, completely and utterly. "Mother will like Judge to be presentable for wedding," Katakuri said mildly. His tone was wholly uncritical despite his words. If Sanji was so bold, he thought the massive man was a little impressed. "Then I hope his doctor is good at his job," Luffy responded with an aggressive shrug, sliding the key into Sanji's shackles. Katakuri's lip twitched upward beneath his scarf, and he waved a hand, releasing Reiju from her temporary confinement back in the hallway. Luffy gave the key a hard twist and the shackles snapped open, dropping to the ground. Nika buzzed in surprise in the back of her mind. "Those were duds," the spirit whispered to her, surprised. Luffy started slightly confused. Who put fake collars on someone who needed to learn their place? He thought they were real, clearly. Someone went around him. So Sanji had an ally in Germa. That was good. But as to the collar itself, it didn't matter. Slave collars were slave collars, even if they couldn't explode, and no one treated her cook like that. Sanji uttered a shuddering breath when the second bracelet clattered harmlessly to the floor. He ran HTHE now bare skin, a dazed smile on his face. He suddenly felt foolish, absurd, that he had been so afraid of his captain coming here. Their circumstances now are still far from ideal, but freed from this bond at least, he remembered who he was. He was more than Judge Vinsmoke's cast-off son. He was a straw hat, and his wonderful, beautiful sunshine would destroy the world itself for his sake. If she was going to be the Pirate King, he couldn't cower in the face of mere nobles and emperors. Luffy yipped when she was suddenly seized in a hug and swept off her feet, Sanji burying his face in her shoulder. "Oh, sunshine. Once again, you've come and saved me. I have never been worthy of you," Sanji babbled, holding her close. Her fist fell down firmly on his head. It was a mild whack, not nearly enough to cause pain, but it was nonetheless quite pointed. "Moron," Luffy berated him, her voice not without warmth. Her small hands rub his shoulders as she firmly hugs back. "Nobody gets to decide that but me. Sanji, I can't become king of the pirates without you. You're my cook, no one else." Sanji almost burst into tears at her resolute words. If he wasn't standing so close to Katakuri and Reiju, he almost certainly would have. Those words said everything about she thought his worth was. She thought him irreplaceable. The corners of his eyes burning painfully, he hugged Luffy tighter, getting a cute little squeak from her. "Thank you," he whispered reverently, the pain in his heart lifting. Thank you. He. Luffy laughed softly, her arms sliding around him gently and her small hands rubbed soft circles on his shoulders. "Silly Sanji. You were waiting for me to come, weren't you? I'll always come for you." Sanji's heart exploded with joy, and he forcibly prevented himself from kissing her. Katakuri's stare was a tangible thing now, and he slowly released his beautiful captain and took a step back. She grinned guilelessly at him, her eyes warm and caring and concerned for him. "I'm glad to see you. I'll stay in contact with you the whole time. I know I'm being a little selfish right now." "Oh, and are the rest of us chopped liver?" Marco rolled his eyes fondly, putting one hand on Ace's shoulder. The younger man was briefly startled before smiling shyly at him. "Relax, Captain. We can hold the fort for a few weeks while you go after our sweet little cousin. Hell, most of us would go with you if we could." The other 10 commanders all nodded seriously, thinking fondly of the wild girl they'd gotten to know in the celebrations after Marineford. Ace smiled, the gesture slightly wobbly with relief and love for them. "Thank you so much. If Teach or Weevil make another attack, call me immediately." His new role made him much more hesitant to leave his crew behind to handle a matter, even one involving Luffy. But his brothers and sisters had accepted his plan almost before he'd finished debriefing them on the situation. He loves them so much. Marco nodded, patting his shoulder again before stepping back. "You going to tell her this time, or are you still planning to use the big brother card?" he teased gently, if meaningfully. Ace swallowed slightly, then glowered at his brothers when they all started snickering. "You guys are the worst," he said dryly. "I'll figure it out." "So it's one of those plans," Marco said in amusement. Ace punched him in the shoulder without looking at him. "One more thing, Ace. Once she's headed to Wano, you'll pass it along, right?" A more serious look crossed Ace's expression. Of course I will, Marco. Izo. The 7th Division commander's shoulders shivered a little, and he gave his new captain a grateful look. Ace gave him a solemn little smile. They both had promises to fulfill there, after all. All right. I'm headed out, hold the line. Try not to set too much of Totland on fire. Marco called after him as Ace turned and walked off. The Ravenet rolled his eyes and picked up the pace, jumping down from the hill to the open beach below. This was about par for the course of that birdbrain's ideas of being a wingman. He'd been much worse on Sayobody. Sabo waiting for him there, one hand in his pocket and looking a little impatient. Waiting there with him was Karasu, looking a little long-suffering. Kept me waiting, Captain. Sabo said chidingly. Screw you, Ace retorted affectionately before giving the blonde a one-armed hug. Meeting him again when he'd gone to visit Luffy after training at Asteria Island had been one of the best moments of his entire life. Granted he'd wanted to punch Dragon in the face. If he wasn't such an absentee dad to Luffy up until now, they would have found out Sabo was alive years ago. But he'd also been the one to save Sabo's life, so Ace had reluctantly let go of the impulse. Have you heard from Nami? They're in Totland now, and Big Mom is actually consenting to giving Luffy a minuscule amount of time to get to know Katakuri before she tries to force a marriage. Sabo said, sounding a little incredulous. She thinks it won't matter. Ace stated, scowling. Luffy's in her territory, if she says no, Linlin will just try to trap her there and force the issue. Sabo nodded in agreement and tossed Ace a long black overcoat with a hood. Put that on. I'll give you a mask once we're closer. Ace arched an eyebrow, unfolding the dark fabric. And that's going to make us less conspicuous? He asked sarcastically. If you want to make it more than 100 knots of that place without being recognized, oh Emperor of Flame, then yes. Sabo said, using the new epithet teasingly despite his equal dryness. Or would you rather spend the next 2 weeks fighting off Linlin's entire family before even getting to see Lou? The Ravenet huffed, but put the coat on and zipped it up before dropping his hat down his back, the string pressing gently against his throat. Bring them on. I prefer a straight fight to sneaking around. Asteria had reforged him so a statement like that wasn't foolish as it used to be. Sabo smirked. Barbarian. He glanced sideways at Karasu and pointed skyward. Let's get going, Karasu. The sun won't slow down for our sake. Karasu sighed deeply. I am never playing poker with you again. Never. He rolled one arm and then transformed. Ace put his arm up as the man's figure dissolved into a massive murder of crows. Sabo grinned and grabbed his wrist, bringing him up onto one of the big ravens' back before Karasu takes off, the fleet of bird forming a black cloud that concealed them within. Ace cursed and pinwheeled his arms slightly as his sense of balance reoriented itself and he could sit up straight without feeling vertigo. He gave his brother a dirty look. Sabo just chuckled. We'll get there in a day and a half, the blonde told him. Good. Ace exhaled and looked out at the ocean before them. There were storms everywhere across the horizon, typical of the New World, though he doesn't usually see it from this angle. It's beautiful in its savagery. Sabo glanced sideways at him. I'm going to tell her, he told the Ravenet conversationally, if slightly gently. Maybe not right away, but he lets the sentence hang, to see if the conversation will continue or be quietly rebuffed. Ace understands, his shoulders twitching slightly. We promised a long time ago she wouldn't tear us apart, he said quietly. You're not going to say anything? Sabo asked, faintly incredulous. Ace's shoulders hunched up a bit. Shut it, she's called me Big Brother for years and years. What will she even think if I say that I? He bit his bottom lip hard. What if she can't feel that way about me? If she finds it repulsive, I can't face that, Sabo. Sabo's expression softened just a little. Usually Ace's reticence to talk about the depth of his emotions about their raven-haired beloved drove him a little spare. His brother was usually so brash and fearless that it was a little infuriating to see him so nervous. But he could understand this fear. He'd be lying if he said it never. Whoa, Luffy will never find you repulsive, you know her. Ace didn't respond, though his lip twitched upward slightly. I know I'm going to regret throwing my hat in this ring, Karasu said somewhat dryly, his voice bouncing between the many ravens. But what are you two going to do if Luffy decides for whatever reason that she wants to marry this guy? There's a moment of uncomfortable silence between the brothers as they ponder the possibility and reluctantly acknowledge that it did exist. Then Sabo shrugged and aggressively cheerfully said, "Then I guess we'll end up being joint husbands." Ace sputtered and yanked his hat down, his cheeks absolutely on fire. "What? Roger had multiple husbands, and sometimes I think Luffy is her actual child instead of you." Can we please not bring my mother into this?" Ace protested, flustered. "Why?" Sabo said. "I thought I recalled you saying that surgeon who saved her was a little cute, or were you just in a happy haze over him saving her? I will shove you off this bird. So you do have something in common with her after all." "Sabo," Karasu groaned. He could already tell this was going to go on for a while. "Why did I open my big, fat beak?" The revolutionary commander berated himself silently as the brothers' back and forth grew louder. "I know better by now, so why? Luffy, please do marry him so I can get a break from this gremlin occasionally." End chapter. "A slave collar?" Big Mom repeated between stuffing her mouth with muffins. Luffy nodded, aggravated at the reminder, and the huge woman burst into an incredulous fit of laughter. Nami flinched slightly, while neither Katakuri nor Pudding looked fazed. What an imbecile! No pirate captain worth being called one would let such an insult slide, much less Nika. Is he still alive? "Yup," Luffy responded, sipping from the tea offered to her. "It's really sweet, she's in a sweet candy wonderland." "You're more magnanimous than I would have been in your place," Big Mom said with what almost sounded like something resembling approval, though of course she followed that up with, "People will think you're soft if you take that tact." Luffy could only shrug, more interested in the confections on the table than an old lady lecturing her on how to be a pirate. Her only concern had been that she might have caused problems for Sanji's sis, but Linlin's irritation at Reiju subbing in for her father at the tea party seems to have been mollified. Luffy was pretty sure she shouldn't trust it, but she'd accept it for what it was for now. This tea party was awkward enough as it was. Big Mom towered over everyone in the room, her massive chair overshadowing the large round table where she's seated. It was the largest table Luffy had ever seen, and she's pretty sure it's made entirely of sugar. She'd given it a lick and her eyes nearly crossed. Sitting around the table are Reiju, Sanji, Pudding, Brook, Nami, Chopper, Katakuri and herself. Katakuri was sitting at her left and Nami at her right, while Sanji and Pudding were across from her. And those were the guests she recognized. There were a few more of Big Mom's children there, and a bird guy named Morgans who was constantly taking pictures of her. What was even up with that? Did the sundress and red sweater that Nami had thrown at her to wear that morning look strange on her or something? Warriors weren't usually pretty, yeah. Lord knew she'd heard that more than enough in her life, but it wasn't that weird, was it? Luffy didn't know what to make of it, so she pretty much ignored the guy as he rambled about big news. Which wasn't hard, given the other eccentricities of the party. The table was piled high with treats and pastries of all kinds, which would be amazing if they didn't all talk, sing, and scream in horror when eaten. Nami and Chopper had to quickly squash their horrified expressions when they first saw Big Mom chow down on some donuts that had simultaneously been weeping with fear and asking her if they tasted good, then rapidly plastered pleased grins on their faces and made themselves eat when the Emperor glanced their way and asked if something was wrong. Luffy hadn't thought anything could interfere with a good sweet binge, but she'd piled her plate high and she's only halfway through it. She'd never eaten something that was conscious enough to beg her to stop. It was extremely uncomfortable. She'd rather be outside and eating the houses or drinking from the chocolate fountains. Whenever she was trying to distract herself from the oddities of her food, she found herself staring at Pudding, Sanji's fiancé. She's a slender, perfectly feminine woman. She isn't willowy and pure muscle the way Luffy was. She isn't all scarred up from pirate life despite being one of the Big Mom pirates. Her eyes are wide and expressive and kind, and her long brown hair is nicely styled. She's attentive to Sanji across the tea party, offering him various treats and bashfully admitting to having baked a decent number of them herself. She seemed really nice. So why did looking at her make Luffy feel mad and upset? It bubbled unpleasantly in her stomach when she watched Pudding talk to Sanji, like she'd gotten food poisoning. They were well matched. This is a good thing. She'd have to clear out rooms for her and Katakuri on the Sunny, just in case they end up getting married. Her chest squeezed really hard at the thought, and she didn't understand why. Luffy blinked hard and promptly shoved a cupcake into her mouth. Distraction. She needs a distraction. These were pretty good treats. Pudding's a good chef. Nope, need to find something else to think about. Hey lady, Luffy piped up after swallowing, looking up at Big Mom. Nami gave her some pretty intense side-eye at that. Is there anywhere around here that people can spar at? Big Mom arched an eyebrow. Of course. My children need to practice, after all. The new world devours those who become complacent. Cool, Luffy said, before turning to face Katakuri and clapping her hands together. Hey Kat, let's fight after this. I want to see how strong you are for myself. He blinked at her, and she thought he might be smiling underneath his scarf. He hasn't taken it off since she met him yesterday, as far as she knows. It looks really cool, but doesn't it get hot occasionally? His eyes are expressive, though, and not hard to read. Very well, he said noncommittally. Luffy beamed and pivoted toward Reiju. You can come too, Reggie, she offered hopefully. Reiju blinked, the only concession she made to the very startled look in her blue eyes. It lasted about a second before she replaced it with a neutral smile. Dang, that was fast. It sort of reminded Luffy of Nami. Way back before they fought Arlong and she was hiding her plans, and her pain, behind a teasing, playful attitude. I would loathe to intrude on time between you two, she said politely. That's fine, you can join us afterward. I've started reading the Sora comics and the Germa stories are super neat. Nami looked like she wanted to bash her head into the table, while Chopper smiled a little awkwardly. I want to see what you can really do. You're so cool in the comic. Reiju giggled slightly, touching her lips with 2 fingers. Ah, Sora. Father finds the comics quite vexing, but I'll admit to being a little fond of them. Odd though it is to read about a mimic of yourself. Big Mom uttered a loud laugh that rattled the room. Your father should develop a sense of humor. The Emperor chuckled merrily. Good plan, a very good plan. Once you're married, you'll be fighting together whenever the situation demands it. Luffy resisted the urge to object to the woman treating the marriage like a done deal when she hasn't agreed to it yet. Trafi had said several times to tread carefully around her. The princess will learn something from observing you. Katakuri is the strongest of my many, mighty children. Utterly undefeated in every battle he's participated in. Nami and Chopper wordlessly pivot to stare uneasily at Katakuri, who declined to brag or preen at his mother's praise. Luffy's vision snapped back to her maybe fiancé, fascinated. Really? She prodded. That was really impressive if it was true. You flatter me, mother. Katakuri demurred. It didn't escape Luffy that it wasn't quite an answer. Nonsense, I speak the truth. Big Mom responded haughtily. Ooh. Luffy made a little excited noise. Remembering what Rayleigh said about how Haki could only increase in power in battle against another person capable with it. She and Katakuri could really help each other. It's a match made in the heavens, big news, Morgan crowed, only somewhat putting his energy on. The sun goddess is marrying. Ah, the whole world would come to your doorstep if you would allow them, mama. Luffy sputtered, snapped out of her happy thoughts. Why the hell would I want the whole world to be at my wedding? What a bunch of weirdos. The only people I'd want there would be my family and the other family. Ah yes. Family, Big Mom said, a leer forming on her face. Luffy slowly turned to meet her eyes, feeling the temperature in the room drop slightly. I apologize that I can't fully accommodate you in that regard. I heard you grew up with Goldie Ace, yes? Though there's no blood between you. There's a bloody red light in her eyes when she said that name, rage seething inside her at the memory of a certain mocking note she'd found taped to Glyph. Fucking Roger. Now that she knew, she couldn't look at the brat's wanted poster without seeing the bitch's features in him. Like she was taunting him from beyond the grave. She wanted him dead very badly. He goes by Portgas, Luffy corrected, frowning, but yeah, we did. Well, I'm afraid he can't enter Totland, nor that old man Garp. Big Mom swirled her glass of wine lazily. The Whitebeards and the Marines are my family's sworn enemies. There's too much bad blood that's been spilled for my people to be comfortable having them here. I'm sure they're displeased about your future union. I hope that you're prepared for future difficulties on that front. Luffy's spine stiffened as she processed that statement for a minute, eventually figuring out what Big Mom was teasing her about. If she married Katakuri, the Emperor expected her to fight on her side against Ace and Gramps. 2. Treat them as her enemies. Fight them like she'd fought the admirals at Marineford. Rage bubbled up in her like a pressure cooker, hot and unbelievable. Nami and Chopper were both giving her wide-eyed looks, her navigator frantically waving her hand on the table. Don't rise to it, she's baiting you. Sanji was staring steadily at her with concern in his eyes. And Luffy fought to just breathe. Can't punch her, can't start a fight here, it would put her Nakama in danger. The gall of this old hag. Then again, I suppose you wouldn't expect much from Garp, after he betrayed you at Marineford. Big Mom continued, taking a drink and acting as though she was making casual small talk. Katakuri's eyes darted between her and his fiancée, trying to find some way to break into the conversation and redirect it. He was going to watch Gol be executed, despite having raised him. What a coward. He betrayed the Marines by raising the boy. But he wasn't willing to stop play-acting when he was caught. Haha. When you've become a parent, one should be committed. Don't talk about him like that, Luffy muttered, gripping the edge of the table. The heavy sugar whined under the pressure. Big Mom glanced down at her. Hey, what, did I say something wrong? She asked with both sarcasm and false sincerity. Brook flicked the strings of his guitar, which he'd insisted on bringing with him to the meal for reasons known only to himself. Like magic, everyone paused and turned toward him. Young lady, he addressed Big Mom casually. I've been accosted by some crowds of your civilians on the way here who recognize me from my days performing. They've been earnestly pleading for me to play for them, and I was wondering if a proper concert could be set up with your permission. The Emperor's eye twitched at the manner he'd chosen to address her, before melting into something more thoughtful, hungry for ways to show off what she believes is her newest acquisitions. Luffy breathed out and stared daggers into the table, trying to will herself to relax. I think that would be wonderful, Mama, Pudding chipped in, having gone a little pale when her mother started speaking and jumping on the lifeline provided with both hands. I enjoyed the Soul King's music quite a lot. In fact, why not have him conduct the orchestra at the wedding as well? I've never heard anything better. There's an idea, Sanji said, blinking rapidly. Law might be able to do something with that, should they have to fight their way out of the wedding itself. Luffy managed to force a smile. Brook is the best musician there is, she agreed amiably. I suppose that would be interesting, Big Mom decided after a moment. I never heard any of those concerts myself. Pudding excitedly started to talk about a venue, rehearsals and getting Brook some backup singers, and about halfway through the rambled conversation, Luffy and the others sans Sanji and the skeleton musician himself are given permission to leave the room. Luffy snatched a final cupcake and tried to leave the room without making her aggravation obvious. She's not very good at that. How does anyone on this island still have their teeth? Law wondered as he walked down the back streets of another chocolate and gingerbread town, Pedro at his heels. After a few hours of sneaking around the previous day and today, he's finally gotten enough local information and some reliable maps to feel confident starting to plan out escape routes for when Big Mom inevitably springs her trap. As painful as trying to plan around Luffy is, when he still can't figure out if she's sincerely letting Katakuri try to woo her, or if the man has any chance at succeeding. Good dentists, I presume. Pedro said slightly shortly. We're almost back. Guards are coming. Law muttered something under his breath and promptly swapped their position with that of a few passers-by a road over. The foot soldiers were out in force thanks to the upcoming wedding, which was part of the reason this took so long. Sneaking around them was irritating, especially with limited use of his devil fruit powers lest he give himself away. The permanently sweet smell in the air was only outmatched by the syrup rain in how insufferable it was. He felt compelled to rinse his mouth out whenever he had the chance. There wasn't much respite in the hotel that the Straw Hats had been put up in, while the structure itself was made of wood and stone, which saved them from waking up to discover that Luffy had devoured the wall to her room, but the beds, dressers and other furniture was all made of gingerbread held together by thick icing. Needless to say, they'd had to request replacements for basically everything twice times already. Nami was threatening to put Luffy on an all-vegetable diet until they found Raftel if she ran up a bill with the interior decoration store, and Law was pretty sure that was the only time in their entire acquaintance he'd seen the sun goddess look legitimately terrified. including at Marineford. Returning to the bronze-painted building through a back alley, Law looked up at the third floor and tossed a stone against it. After about 20 seconds the frame slid up and Nami peered out over the edge. She sighed in relief and waved at them. "Oh, there you are. Get in, quick." She didn't have to tell him twice. Law opened a room and shambled himself and then Pedro into the obnoxiously brightly colored bedroom. It's painted to look like the top of an elegant cake covered in jelly beans. Nami immediately closed the window and pulled the heavy purple curtains down before running to the door. "Can you hear anyone, Carrot?" she asked the mink urgently, looking up and down the hall before closing the door and locking it. "Nope." Carrot shook her head vigorously. "We're alone for now." "What a relief." Chopper groaned. "I was worried she'd have somebody watching us all the time." Law looked around the room and frowned. Somebody fairly important was absent, as well as Brooke. "Where's Lou, Straw Hat?" he asked. Nami winced. "The tea party was a little difficult," she said uncomfortably. A chill ran down her arms at the reminder, and she rubbed her tattoo subconsciously. Law's eye twitched, alarm bubbling in his chest. "Difficult how?" he demanded. Big Mom tried to get a rise out of Luffy, and it almost worked. Chopper responded, flopping down on the ground and looking a little haunted, no doubt imagining what they might have just narrowly avoided. So she left with Katakuri to do some sparring matches with him. They'll be gone for a while, I think. Sanji blew out a puff of smoke, looking troubled. Better that she vent her anger in training than the alternative. Law nodded sharply in agreement, even as he scowled. Knowing how fiery Luffy's temper was when provoked, he just counted his blessings that she'd managed to keep it all in instead of reacting. A very rare show of restraint from her. He reminded himself to thank red-haired Shanks someday. "I see. Big Mom doesn't regard anyone as equals, except maybe Kaido," Pedro said, and there's a faint undercurrent of bitter experience in his desire is for Luffy, Nika, to be her subordinate and her weapon. She'd need to tremendously break down her will to make such a thing even possible without hostages. "It's our fortune that the revolution is securing your home islands in the East Blue from her assassins." "Truly?" Sanji blurted out, eyes widening. Nami gave him a concerned look. "Yeah. I called Sabo and he assured me that it's taken care of." "Sanji, were you told?" "My birth father," Sanji bit out the words, "told me that if I didn't acquiesce to the marriage, he would have the old geezer killed. I have absolutely no doubt he'd carry out his threat if he felt provoked, so I'd resigned myself to. The Bharati is safe, truly?" Nami nodded firmly, and the blonde-haired chef almost collapsed in pure relief, what looked like a lifetime's worth of stress leaving his shoulders. "Thank goodness. They're all safe. I might kiss that man if I see him again," Sanji babbled, ashing his cigarette. Carrot giggled softly, her eyes shining with happiness. "Luffy-chan has so many allies," she said. "It's her superpower." Nami mused. "She doesn't try to convince anyone of anything. She just follows her heart and her gut, and people get drawn to her like moths to a flame." Law snorted quietly. Knowing damn well he was one of said moths, he instead said, "Nami, you have the white den on you, yes? Has anyone seen it?" "Of course not. Who do you take me for?" Nami responded, almost sounding offended. She walked over to one of the drawers and opened it, withdrawing a small box habitat and returning to the circle on the carpet. Sliding the box open revealed the white snail Law had stolen some time ago. "Where did you even find one of these? The world government tries to keep them all to itself." "Same place I got the polar tang," Law responded easily before starting to dial up his first mate. Sanji straightened up and became serious again as the snail began to rain. The dialing sound made Law wish for the calm fruit. A familiar old pain twisted in his stomach at the errant thought. It only rang a few times before the clack of a pickup made everyone relax. "Captain?" Beppo's warm, caring voice echoed from the other end. "Is that you?" "Yes, it's me," Luffy said, letting out the little breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We're in Totland, and the Straw Hats have met with both the Vinsmokes and Big Mom. Status update, Beppo." "Oh, so everything's gone smoothly so far. Thank goodness," Beppo sighed, and Law elects not to tell him about Luffy beating Judge unconscious immediately after meeting him until later. "We've landed in Wano." Robin and Kinnaman have started finding jobs and identities for everyone to slip into society unnoticed. Ah, let me go get them for you. The snail phone was briefly abandoned as the mink rushed out, calling for the samurai and straw hats. They made it, Nami said in relief. I wish Luffy was here for this. I'll have to catch her up later. She's going to sulk a lot. Well, we'll just make sure she doesn't miss the next one. Sanji responded, looking a little amused. There's a sound of a lot of footsteps on the other end of the call. Sanji, is that you? Usopp's excited voice echoed in the room. Sanji, Frankie cheered. You're in one piece. I mean, you were right? The evil empire didn't treat you too badly, did they? Do we need to crush some skulls? It's very good to hear your voice, Sanji-san, Robin said warmly, her voice joining the kerfuffle moments later. The snail spasmed a little as it tried to figure out whose facial features it wants to emulate with half a dozen people fighting over the receiver. We've been worried. Speak for yourself, Zoro groused, his irritated voice hiding his genuine relief. Good to hear you didn't give Luffy any trouble, shit cook. You're hilarious, Sanji retorted instantly, more out of habit than anything. A shaky smile crossed his lips at the barrage of familiar voices, and he quickly put a hand over his mouth to suppress his joy at his crewmate's happiness upon hearing his voice. I'm fine, all factors considered. Oh, what a relief. Usopp cheered. We've been so worried. Where's Luffy? Zoro asked, the transponder snail frowning slightly. I thought we'd hear her voice by now. Nami sighed. She's venting some anger at Big Mom in a training area with Katakuri. She explained succinctly what happened during the tea party. The temperature in the room dropped about 2 degrees, it was tangible. I'm pleased Luffy managed to stay calm, Robin murmured, the first to speak. Temper runs so fiercely in her family, though Dragon's runs much colder than hers. The crew knew how easy Luffy was to rile up. The Davy back fight she'd gotten them stuck in was just one of many examples. Law only had to think of her reaction to Caesar and what he'd done to the children at Punk Hazard for a reminder, himself. This is such a bad idea. Usopp groaned. Why didn't we just call up Dragon or Shanks or her 2 terrifying grandfathers? Law's shoulder twinged a little at the memory of Fleet Admiral Zephyr crashing down upon the island where Doflamingo had sprung his trap on him, ready to fight him and his government minion Fujitora in the name of true justice. Tell them that Luffy is getting married, and then run away as fast as we can. Nami sighed longingly at the thought. Luffy won't give up a fight with the Emperors, Frankie responded, rather needlessly in Law's opinion. Even if they do show up, she's gonna stick around to get her punches in, especially after this. Usopp groaned pitifully. Law wondered why he was still so anxious and fearful after being instrumental in Doflamingo's downfall. Few better snipers existed in the world. The Surgeon of Death could say that fairly confidently now. Those 4 might learn about this, he spoke up, if big news. Morgan decides that this is worthy of being on the front page for all 4 blues. Morgan, you mean the bird guy from the tea party? Chopper asked in confusion. I thought he was just some newspaper guy? Not some newspaper guy, Chopper yaw. Morgan is in charge of the news that spreads across the world. Only the world government itself has a bigger influence on what the world sees, hears and believes to be true. Law corrected the younger doctor. Hard to get bigger news than the sun goddess, possibly marrying, Frankie noted sourly. Especially if he writes it up and presents it like it's a done deal. You've got to be kidding me, Zoro bit out, his voice hard with annoyance. Morgan is Linlin's guest, Law acknowledged. There's a chance he won't publish anything yet if she doesn't want him to, but the possibility exists. Hot, boiling annoyance lanced through him at that thought. Luffy's marriage being proclaimed without her consent when she hadn't decided anything and he wasn't the groom, but put a pin in that for now and tell me how you're going to integrate into Wano, and when we can expect your next call. Kinnaman spoke up then, and for the next 30 minutes he and Law debated, shared information, and began delivering some basic orders to the Supernova Alliance in Wano. The most important one, of course, being that secrecy was paramount. Kaido and the Shogun Orochi could not be made aware of their presence until everything and everyone needed for the uprising was prepared. Otherwise, everyone was to learn as much as they could, try to gather support with Kozuki loyalists and those who wanted to escape Kaido's despotic rule, and wait for the Sanji extraction team, as Luffy had named them, to arrive on the shores. Law was tempted to suggest Zoro find a travel buddy for safety's sake, but he knew it would only rile the other swordsmen up and that he was already quite talented at giving his crew the slip entirely by accident. "Hey Sanji," Luffy asked Reiju to come spar with her and Katakuri. Nami remembered suddenly, once Law had finished giving Beppo his orders for his crew and the Straw Hats reluctantly hung up. "Can you tell us a little about your sister?" Sanji's expression tof complicated emotions. "I can't say that I know her very well. Even before I fled Germa," he admitted quietly, taking Law off guard. He didn't know his sister. Lammy flashed through his mind, how she'd always been in his peripheral vision, how she'd stay in his room for hours chattering happily at him while he studied medical textbooks and begged him to come out to festivals with her. The idea of her being a stranger to him was so anathema, it left him dumbfounded, even drowning out the twinge of pain he felt at her memory. The cook drew out a new cigarette, heedless of the closed windows, and fumbled with his lighter a few times before he managed to get it lit. "Reiju was the closest I had to an ally in my father's house after my mother died," Sanji said slowly, sitting back against the dresser. "Judge has no love for me, never has. When I was a child, I didn't demonstrate the kind of superhuman strength that my brothers and sister possess, and I didn't have their temperament either. My brothers are cruel and vindictive. I served not as their brother but their training dummy with that man's tacit approval." Nami's mouth fell open in shock, and she and Chopper's horrified stares drilled into Sanji. Pedro gave the chef a comparatively softer sympathetic look, while Carrot's face was full of disbelief. "Reiju would find me and patch me up whenever I was alone," Sanji said, his mouth twisting. "She told me she was sufficiently terrified of joining my ignoble position in the family that she pretended to go along with their loathing and disdain for me in public. She was the closest to mother, other than me. Yet she didn't cry at her funeral for fear of showing weakness." Something ugly twisted in Law's gut, a feeling he knew well, and associated with blonde hair and sunglasses. With fatal gunshots in a snow-swept landscape. His grip on Kikoku tightened, his knuckles slowly going white. "She never defended me to them, never stepped between me and my brothers when they beat me," Sanji said vehemently, old pain audible in his voice. Not understanding why the only person who showed him a motive of kindness wasn't willing to do any more than just that. "And yet, when Judge banished me to a cell in the castle to waste away my entire life, it was Reiju who broke me out and helped me escape over the red line into the East Blue. When Luffy demanded to know who, one hand shot to his bare wrists, had put me in this position she found so offensive, Reiju pointed her at Judge without missing a beat. I don't know why, she did not say or imply anything even when I asked." Sanji breathed out a cloud of smoke, squeezing his lighter. "I don't know her, Nami Swan," he said quietly, "but I don't think she'd make much of an ally, and I don't think we should risk telling her much. Why would she defend me now?" "Sanji." Nami looked lost, one hand over her mouth. Remembering her own sister, how Najiko had gotten a soffish tattoo so she would feel less alone those painful years working for Arlong. "You say your brothers were superhuman at birth," Law prodded, somewhat gently, by his standards, yet it's still netting him death glares from the two other Straw Hats. In the Sora comics, the king of Germa calls his children perfect creations of science. Is that why? Sanji snorted. "It's called lineage factor," he said. "That man's most prized success outside of my brothers, no doubt. It makes the person it's used upon superhuman in strength, speed, reaction time, everything, and it works in perfect tandem with the raid suits." Didn't seem to stop Luffy from breaking the ground with Sparking Red's face. Chopper jumped in, his eyes sharp with anger. Sanji chuckled, a little tension going out of his shoulders immediately. A familiar stab of jealousy pierced Law's gut. "It's not fair to compare Sunshine to mere mortal men," he said with a small, but genuine, smile. "Against most opponents, Ichiji would not be so completely embarrassed." "Well, Sunshine has taken a shine to your sister, if she's inviting her to spar," Nami pointed out. "Luffy is a decent judge of character. Or she's just so overwhelming that her stubbornness and confidence bowls anyone she takes interest in into submission." Law deadpanned, even though he agreed with the navigator. "Which means we'd best unravel the secrets of Poison Pink, lest she make this ridiculous situation we're in even more complicated." Sanji looked conflicted for a moment, before nodding. "You're right. Law felt a jab of excitement. A ready-made excuse to shadow the real Poison Pink and learn her secrets. The idea of speaking to her made his heart almost flutter, which made him rapidly try to shake the emotions off and keep his face stoic. He could handle this. He could speak to her like a normal fucking human being. Maybe his Luffy would decide she liked her enough to drag her onto their crew. He might fall in love with her a second time if… No, focus. There was a time and a place for that. Chapter 9. Luffy stomped down the road after Katakuri, grumbling ferociously to herself. If Kat minded how obviously pissed off at his mother she was, he wasn't voicing it, merely showing her in the way in relative silence. It wasn't too uncomfortable, but it didn't escape Luffy's notice that the people they did walk by gave them a wide berth. Luffy didn't do well with silence. Eventually, her need for a conversation overcame her aggravation, and she sighed. "Are we close?" she asked. "It's only a minute's walk from here," Katakuri responded, his voice steady. His bearing reminded her a little bit of Zoro. How he radiated calm and confidence, how nothing rattled him. "I apologize for that." "Why are you sorry?" Luffy asked, her brow wrinkling. "You didn't do anything." Katakuri's shoulders twitched slightly at that. Her words had struck on something sensitive, Luffy realized, but she couldn't for the life of her figure out what. "What are the terms of a sparring match with you?" he inquired instead, brushing past the topic. "I can't promise that you won't get some sizable bruises." Briefly surprised by the question, Luffy giggles, her shoulders relaxing. She. "It wouldn't be much of a spar if I was worried about bruises," she said cheerfully. "I'd be really embarrassed if you treated me like a China doll." Katakuri glanced sideways at her, his lip curling upward slightly. "Good. Personally, I'd prefer it if you didn't turn me into a balloon like you did to Vinsmoke." The sight had been more than a little jarring, though he'd seen more grotesque things in his life. The sheer wrongness of it struck like a tolling bell. Oh, I don't use Gear 5 outside of serious fights," Luffy responded. Katakuri arched an eyebrow at her, so she amended, "I'm not supposed to use it for anything but serious fights. He really pissed me off, though, so I wanted to make a point." She put her hands in her pockets. "Gear 5 takes a lot of energy and it's a lot of power. It's important that I can fight a good fight before I have to use it." Sensible. A bit more sensible than Katakuri expected from this wild girl, honestly. Everything he knew about her and everything she demonstrated since her arrival was that of someone who acted first and thought things through, maybe never. "I shouldn't be so surprised," Katakuri thought chidingly. She broke into and out of Impel Down with half an army's worth of prisoners assisting her cause, all without her crew's assistance. "I see. That is acceptable," he said simply. He was confident he could defeat her if she wasn't using her full power. Luffy smiled that big, sunny, guileless grin of hers at him, pleased. He keeps looking for something behind that smile, searching for any trace of deceit or the sugar-coated malice that he knew so well, and there's just nothing. She's so innocent, it almost feels like a trap. What Big Mom wanted Pudding to be, only effortless and seemingly sincere. Sincerity was deadly. Katakuri squared away the odd feeling in his chest, pushing it deep inside his mind. "This way," he said gruffly, turning right and leading Luffy out of the edge of town and toward a large open field braced on all sides by iron fences. The ground was hard-packed dirt, showing signs of activity from just that morning. There was a wooden shed nearby, holding practice weapons, bottled water and a few shower stalls. Very practical, compared to the sugary indulgence Totland was largely constructed of. He preferred it for that very reason. Luffy made a pleased sound and picked up the pace, running up to the iron-wrought gate. Katakuri opened the door and they both entered. He walked over to one of the side benches and removed his leather coat, dropping it on the hard wood. "Are you ready?" he asked calmly, turning around. Luffy pivoted to face him, grinning. She'd changed out of her sundress for her usual clothes, saying she hadn't wanted to damage Nami's loans. For some reason Katakuri felt a twinge of irrational disappointment at that he did not understand. "I'm always ready," she said, excitement rumbling in her voice. Katakuri relaxed into a fighting stance, then blurred forward. She dodged his first punch with a hiss of steam, dropping into Gear 2 in the blink of an eye. "Whoa!" Luffy yelped. She nearly got hit by that. So fast. Ooh, this was gonna be fun. She tried to punch him. Katakuri simply let his body turn to mochi and blunt the blow without effort. Luffy skittered backward. You ate a devil fruit, she realized. Did you even look at my wanted poster before you came to meet me? Katakuri wondered, completely bemused. How did she not already know this? I wanted to get to know you myself. Luffy responded, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Casual and confident. I don't care what other people say. When I meet people, I trust my heart. So show me yours. Moving in a flash of light, she charged him again. Katakuri blocked and pushed her off to the side, that strange feeling in his chest increasing. Luffy hadn't had this much trouble in spars with someone since she, Ace and Sabo were kids. She kept getting knocked down and Cad didn't look like he was exerting himself much. She had to use gear too just to keep up with him. He was fast, easily faster than Mingo and matching Kizaru at the least, and everything he didn't dodge he tanked. Going all out was not really the purpose of a spar. But Luffy steadily used more and more power to keep even with him, testing his limits. He met her every time. This was amazing. The thrum of excitement bubbling in her chest was all-consuming. She forgot all about that crappy tea party and about Judge and his shitty sons as she threw herself enthusiastically against his fists, blackened with armament hockey now as she kept pushing him. How many rounds had this been going on now? Not enough. Oh, it was like sparring with Boa and her sisters. Luffy had missed this. She could spar with Zoro or Robin on the Sunny, but she didn't learn quite the same when facing a swordsman, and Robin wasn't as physically durable as Boa. Which was fine, she was awesome and powerful in her own right. But Luffy had spent 2 years bruising her knuckles and every other part of her body training with Rayleigh, Boa, and her sisters on Amazon Lily, and having to pull her punches kind of undercut the experience for her. But then again, she'd been pretty spoiled while she was there. Boa always had time for her. Empress, aren't you getting hungry at least? The old woman asked, looking faintly consternation. You've been at this since sunrise. Quiet, Boa said loftily, turning elegantly on her heel to face Luffy as if the mere idea of food was inconsequential. Her expression was full of concentration. Her cheeks colored a bright red from exertion. At least, Luffy assumed that's what it was. No matter how much Boa looked at her with stars in her eyes. My Luffy's haki is improving. Do not disturb us until she is satisfied. The arena where Luffy had originally been brought to fight for her life was a gigantic mess, with debris from the spar everywhere and the stands in a sorry shape. Those girls who had come to admire the practice battles between their empress and the sun goddess had learned to climb trees a decent distance from the area to observe safely. Marguerite and Sandroja were sitting on one of the remaining benches, giving their sister identical pitying looks. I don't mind stopping for food, Luffy said, dropping out of her combat stance. She hasn't had anything since breakfast. We will, in good time, Boa replied placatingly, pressing her hands together. They turned a shimmering black, a sight the Ravenet has become quite familiar with now. You're close to a breakthrough, my dearest, do not be distracted yet. But I'm hungry, Luffy protested with puppy eyes. Boa would have fainted dead away at being the subject of such a gaze a few weeks ago, and her passionate love spent a few seconds violently butting heads with her determination to pass mastery of armament hockey onto the other girl. We can eat as soon as you've accomplished after a few seconds of internal struggle. Luffy pouted, almost giving the warlord a heart attack, but readied herself nevertheless. Now come. Katakuri was easily as tough as Boa, maybe even a little tougher. Or maybe it was the mochi fruit he'd eaten that made him so hard to get around. Though Luffy had amused herself by pretending to be trapped by the mochi at one point in a spar, only to surprise him from behind after eating just enough to get her arm free. His wide-eyed look of surprise had been the most emotion she'd seen out of him so far. Luffy crashed to the ground again with an unceremonious thud, Katakuri stepping backward. Ow! She whined, though it didn't have any teeth in it. Hopping to her feet, she rolled her sleeve up again. You're really tough. I've never seen anyone counter my hawk gatling like that. Are you still not tired? Katakuri asked her, faintly disbelieving. Glancing up at the sky showed him that they had been at this for long hours, yet Luffy had the same excited grin on her face that she'd worn upon their arrival. He's beginning to feel an ache in the many places she'd hit him, telling him that he was going to develop some genuine bruises, basically everywhere. Not for nothing. Luffy, despite what some of his brothers had been confident in saying, was hardly useless without the Nika form. She was fast, and faster still in what she called Gear 2, comfortable with armament hockey, and more than anything, the single most stubborn opponent that Katakuri had ever faced. Even Cracker and Oven would have given up a few hours ago, but the sun was drifting down the western horizon and his fiancée seemed no more tired than when they'd started. It was almost alarming, with the potential relationship between them such a tentative thing that his mother seemed happy to jeopardize needling the much younger captain. He was starting to see why such a guileless, reckless girl had achieved so much in so little time, irregardless of those victories occurring in the calmer parts of the Grand Line. She intrigued him, he couldn't deny it. She was so strange to him, he felt like he was on the back foot in half their conversations. "Nope. I'm having so much fun," Luffy cheered, clapping her hands together. "So Gear 3 isn't enough against you either. Great, I've got some new ideas for what I can do with Gear 4 from after beating up Mingo." She rolled her shoulder, preparing to warp her body into one of its many combat forms. "Let's go." Katakuri opened his mouth to say something when his observation haki trilled, the future jumping out at him the moment he focused on his fiancée. The vision lasted mere seconds, but the alarming sight allowed him to cross the distance between them in a second and bring up a wall of mochi to shield Luffy from her attacker. The dozen or so poisoned arrows hammered into his defensive shield, having been fired fast and hard enough that some of the arrowheads were poking partway through the sweet mochi. Katakuri stared dully at them, his sharp teeth grinding together. "Flamp," he thought in disbelief. "What is she doing?" He's confident that's who he saw half shadowed by the tree she'd taken point in, glaring at the Straw Hat Captain with such burning hatred. "What was that?" Luffy asked, puzzled. "Nothing you need to worry about." Katakuri half lied, before dropping the mochi wall and glaring ferociously out in the direction his younger sister was concealing herself. Looking down at the arrows themselves, he could see the poison glistening on the tips. The color and sliminess of the texture. Flamp had exposed herself to one of those toxic fish to do this. "I'll handle it." He was going to give her a very stern talking to. What was she thinking? In his vision, Luffy had taken the arrows with little more than an aggravated complaint and acted distractingly nonchalant about being violently poisoned. Katakuri hadn't been willing to take the risk, particularly because he was right there. To think he had almost missed that. "I guess somebody here doesn't like me," Luffy observed airily, looking down at the arrows. "Not sure what I did, though." Katakuri's jaw tightened a little, not wanting to explain. Hopefully he could deal with it and never had to. It was only then that he really noticed that he'd pulled Luffy flush against his chest protectively, and his mind briefly stalled out when their eyes met. Because of the height difference, her feet weren't touching the ground, and Luffy had instinctively grabbed his shoulders, her fingers tangled in the fabric of his scarf, to center herself. Now she was holding him loosely in this suddenly intimate position, and her doe-like hazel brown eyes lift up to meet his curiously. Alarm came first, worry that she'd pull the scarf down enough to see his hideous smile. He wanted to grab her hands immediately and move them away, but the sudden change in the situation had him slow to react. "How do you know someone was gonna shoot me?" Luffy asked, seemingly unfazed by this. Katakuri blinked rapidly at her. "I didn't hear anything." "Then you need to practice your observation haki more," Katakuri said a little roughly, hesitantly moving to put her down, though Luffy seemed disinclined to let him, her grip on him holding steady. "My mastery of it allows me to see into the future. That is why I so rarely lose a fight." Luffy's eyes widened. "That's so cool," she enthused. "Teach me how to do that. Please, please, please. I'll bring you so much cake if you teach me. Sanji will make it, it'll be wonderful." Katakuri's breath hitched, and that part of him that he'd become so accustomed to strangling and pushing down wanted so badly to say yes. Cake, donuts, muffins. He'd been out here for so long that he'd missed one of his usual snack breaks. He hadn't noticed that until right now, somehow. He couldn't say yes. Why take the risk of exposing his weakness? And yet that lack of mockery and honest sincerity in her eyes stalled him from bluntly turning her down as he had everyone before her, and he stuck for a long moment as he tried to figure out what to say to her. "You're not embarrassed asking for help," Katakuri said in lieu of answering. At first, he wasn't sure if it was a statement or a question. Luffy tilted her head to the side, her lips quirking lightly. "There's lots of stuff I can't do. She responded unself-consciously, and for a wild moment Katakuri both bitterly envies her and desperately longs for that kind of freedom. That's why I have my nakama, and my family. Whatever one of us can't do, another can. She smiled. If we're gonna get married, it'll be the same for you. We'll take care of what you can't, and you'll do the same for us. Why should I find that embarrassing? She'd take his burdens. She didn't know what she was offering to take on. She doesn't. You're really nice to hug, Luffy decided, because she wasn't done messing with him yet. She looped her arms around him and embraced him fully. Katakuri tried very hard not to go completely stiff in her grip. His mind drew a complete blank. Thanks for guarding me, even though I would have been fine. Her body was so warm. Katakuri was hyper-aware of her almost delicate feeling frame pressed up against his chest, the curve of her hips under his fingers. His heartbeat picked up, erratic and confused, and something else he couldn't put words to before Luffy finally released him and dropped back down to her feet. The sudden lack of that warmth was tangible, and Katakuri swallowed minutely while wondering what the hell was wrong with him. It seemed the reason for the sudden movement was that she'd spotted someone over his shoulder. "Ah, Raiji, I was starting to think you weren't coming." Luffy cheered. Katakuri blinked and turned around himself. Sure enough, the pink-haired first princess of Germa was walking down the dirt road, approaching them with a guarded sort of friendliness. "I had to attend a meeting," Reiju responded by way of explanation, jumping over the fence and landing gracefully in the of sparring still open. "If I'm interrupting something, I could come back tomorrow." "Nope, we were just taking a break," Luffy responded before Katakuri could say yes. He gave his fiancée a slightly exasperated look, but it seemed to bounce right off of her. "Aw, this is so cool. I've read some of the comics where Poison Pink fights. Can you really spit poison?" Reiju gave her a faint but genuine smile. "Of course I can, though I wouldn't use any of my poison powers in a friendly bout. I can do much more than that." Luffy began to almost vibrate in place out of sheer excitement. She looked up at Katakuri with an entreating expression. "Can I go first, please? You can call the matches," she asked. "I'm still gonna beat you, but she's Sanji's sister, Poison Pink. I have to fight her." "So childish," Katakuri mused, before shrugging slightly. "Very well." He stepped off the field as Luffy and Reiju began to take positions, sitting down on the bench. This would give him a window into the princess's thoughts, however narrow, and that made this a good opportunity. Why does a princess have the smile of a bird that has been caged all its life? Katakuri was intimately familiar with smiles. His mother's warped amusements aside, Totland was a place where everyone was supposed to be happy. Its stated mission was to be a paradise where everyone from every race could live in harmony, even if it's in spite of its ruler. The citizens smiled because they were safe from the rest of the world, and because not smiling might offend Big Mom. Among his siblings, smiling was even more important. It kept you from showing weakness and protected you from getting torn apart. Most of the smiles he knew were lies, or the product of blissful ignorance. Vinsmoke Reiju's smile was a carefully manufactured thing, long practiced and worn out from overuse. It was armor, old and strong enough that Katakuri thought of Pudding when he looked at her. "Pudding, I'm sorry I failed you." From the moment he'd met Reiju personally, the only times he'd seen her smile actually reach her eyes was after Luffy destroyed Judge, her father, in a fight in defense of her cook, and right now in the face of the sun goddess's endless friendliness and excitement. Luffy had a magic touch. It seemed very dangerous. "Who are you hiding from, Princess Reiju?" Katakuri wondered as Luffy launched herself at Reiju, who was clearly surprised when her block didn't stop the girl in place but sent her skidding a few feet backward. "Your father, who you have no love for? Your brothers? Your people, royalty were often cruel, as much to each other as their hapless subjects." Vinsmoke Sanji had abandoned his family name as a child in favor of being a mere cook in an East Blue restaurant. Perhaps Reiju wished she could do the same, or had attempted to do so, only to be found out and forcibly brought back into line. Mother intended to wipe out Judge's family. Perhaps Katakuri could approach Reiju and get her assistance in the matter in exchange for freedom from the prison she'd built around herself. No, he needed much more information before he considered that seriously. Mother wasn't likely to spare her, even at his request. Mother only did things for them when she was pleased with their performance. "Thank you, everyone. You're a great audience. I always love seeing you in person." Uda waved at the screaming crowd, the greatest singer in the world, enjoying the moment of comfort and peace she found in making people happy. Her moments of joy were few and far between since she stumbled upon that damning recording. Her plan gave her some respite from the horror and despair that choked her ever since, allowing her to concentrate on preparations, but that wasn't truly a comfort. Seeing smiles on people's faces, knowing she'd lifted their spirits just a little bit in the face of this cruel and unjust world. Knowing she'd done some good in her life was what allowed her to get out of bed in the morning, to not just lie down and die. Taking her water bottle, Uda bowed one more time to the crowd before turning and walking off stage. Dear Gordon smiled and patted her gently on the shoulder. "Get some rest, Uda-chan," he said softly before heading out to make the announcements. Uda headed down the hall, past her bodyguards and toward her dressing room. She can still hear the people chanting her name even as she goes deeper into the building. She had a huge crowd today. The noise could probably be heard for quite a long distance. "My fans are so good to me," she thought fondly. Entering her dressing room, Uda slid out of the feathered coat she'd been wearing for the performance and hung it over a chair with a sigh of relief. It had gotten pretty hot up on stage. She should probably have a shower. But she wanted to sit down first. Her feet were aching from standing and dancing for hours. Sliding into her chair and lifting her legs up with a sigh of relief, Uda looked at her reflection. Her hair could use a brush. She reached up and removed the ties that had been holding it in place. Her stomach twisted a little when her fingers trailed through the scarlet strands on her left side. She'd thought about dyeing it time and again, and yet she never had. Why did it have to remind her of him? Grabbing her hairbrush, Uda began to rake it through her long, stubborn locks, grumbling to herself. Good mood spoiled. While she was in the process of this, one of her den mushi started to ring off its shell. It was the one she gave the number of to various press people, so she grabbed it and unhooked the receiver. "Hello, Uda speaking," she said, hoping she didn't sound tired. "Uda, my lady," Morgan's cheerful voice echoed from the other end. Uda's eye twitched slightly. She wasn't the biggest fan of this guy, but he was somewhat of a necessary evil. "I deeply apologize for taking so long to get back to you. I've been invited to Whole Cake Island, you see, for the marriage of the century." "I'm sure Lin says that about all her children's weddings," Uda responded with manufactured politeness. "No need to apologize for that. I know Lin doesn't tolerate being made to wait." She'd heard horror stories from her fans who'd had the misfortune of falling into her orbit. "You received my letter?" "Yes, I did. What a magnificent undertaking you have planned. I'd gladly advertise such big news under any circumstances. Hell, I do it free of charge," Morgan said gleefully. "Can you give me an exact date yet, or are you still in preparations?" "I'll be able to give you one soon," Uda said confidently. "I believe everything will be ready in 3 months, maybe 2. Once I've secured the concert hall, I'll be able to give you the date." That's good, Morgan cheered. "It'll give some time for the news of the sun goddess marrying to die down just a little, keep you from getting overshadowed." Uda's hairbrush yanked violently through a tangle and went spinning off onto the floor. The songstress stared at the snail in mute shock and disbelief for a minute. "The sun goddess?" she repeated dully. "You mean Monkey D. Luffy? Who else would that title be referring to?" It had almost eclipsed her original epithet of Straw Hat. Yet she dearly hoped, somehow, she's marrying? "Ah, I haven't published it yet, so this is technically a leak. But I can make an exception for one of my favorite news ladies," Morgan chirped, apparently oblivious to the shift in Uda's demeanor. "Yes? Monkey D. Luffy has gone to Totland to be courted by Big Mom's third son, Charlotte Katakuri. In 2 weeks we'll see if they tie the knot or not. This is my biggest story in years. Ever since Marineford, I've never been this excited." "I see," Uda croaked. Her hands were starting to shake. I'd better not keep you long, since you're staying on Totland. I'll call you back once the venue is secured." Uncaring of how rude it might be, she quickly hung up and collapsed back in her chair, staring blankly at the ceiling. Luffy was getting married to a Charlotte. The trembling spread her shoulders, and Uda tasted bile in the back of her throat. Luffy appeared in her mind's eye, smiling, kind, always picking her up when she fell, her beautiful soul shining out in everything she did. She hadn't seen her in years until she came across her first wanted poster by chance, but she remembered their every interaction as clearly as if they'd been together just yesterday. Her childhood love had grown up into a beautiful young woman, and even though she'd become a pirate, Uda's heart had been lost a second time the moment she saw her picture. She'd followed her path along the Grand Line like a shark chasing after blood in the water, grabbing every newspaper and listening in on every marine report and asking her fans about her. She'd heard so many wonderful things. Luffy wasn't much of a pirate. She was too busy saving everyone she stumbled into on the way to her dream. Alabastan fans enthused about how she was their true savior and gleefully regaled how she defeated Crocodile. A small town called Kokoyashi chipped in with how she liberated them from the control of the Arlong pirates. Water 7 crowed about how she and her crew beat down the CP9 plants that had infiltrated their shipyard businesses and saved Mayor Iceberg's life. Sayobati natives whispered about how she punched a celestial dragon in the face with zero fear. And now Fishman Island and Dressrosa too had been saved from certain mass murder and death thanks to her. Uda adored her, and had watched the Marineford battle horror-struck from beginning to end. She'd seen her awakening to her true power in desperate hope of saving that pirate. A hot, twisting knot of emotions filled her chest. Jealousy, that Luffy cared so much about some phantom man that she'd destroy herself for his sake. Guilt for feeling that way. Anger at the world government for trying to kill Portgas d'Ace just for being Roger's son. He had undoubtedly committed actual crimes as the 2nd Division commander. But they didn't accuse him of a single one of them. Just tried to use his parentage as an excuse to use him as Roger's stand-in. It was disgusting. And terror when Luffy collapsed and didn't get up. Terror when Portgas couldn't rouse her and the revolutionary she'd broken out of impelled down could do nothing. Terror when he was forced to hand her over to the goddamned surgeon of death in the hope that he could save her life. Terror was waiting for weeks with no peep from anyone she could reach on if Luffy was even alive. With the demon laughing and whispering in her ear. Uda didn't want to be in a world without her, she couldn't live. She survived. Uda had collapsed in a sobbing heap of joy when she finally saw Luffy alive and standing in the paper, using a mark on her arm to signal her crew about when they would reunite. She wasn't ashamed of that, of the depths of her feelings. When she entered the new world, Uda had waited and listened with bated breath for when they would meet again. But now that joy and hope has all transformed into horror and dread. Lin must know about Dawn Island. The sickening certainty swirled in Uda's gut, reminding her of Makino and Wool Slap and the kind people who lived there, who raised Luffy and now were probably hostages in a farce of a wedding designed to make her that monster's minion and prisoner. Would Dragon help her? Would he do anything? Or did he prioritize his mission over his own daughter? Like Shanks. Luffy, trapped, in chains, at the mercy of that evil bitch and her psychotic children. So what if Katakuri was known as the most noble and decent among them? He was still his mother's obedient dog. What would he do to Luffy if they married? What would he want from her as a bride? Uda couldn't breathe. Panic and overwhelming rage bubbled in her chest, and she gripped the arms of her chair in a desperate attempt to stop shaking. She couldn't do this. She won't get away with this. Not to Luffy, not her son and her light. Then you know what to do. Uda jerked upright, her blood freezing in her veins. Leave me alone, she whispered, the blood draining out of her face. A rattling, musical laugh echoed in her ears, like broken glass. Uda slowly turned and looked at the mirror. She recoiled in horror when she saw that her eyes were blank and little rivers of yellow were visible in the blues. You can create that world in an instant. Rescue Luffy and bring her into the world where she'll never be taken from you again. You'd be together forever and ever, in that beautiful dream. You don't want to help me, Uda said thickly, balling up her hands into fists. It was a weak attempt at bravado and she knew it. She's completely frozen in horror at the being's presence. I know what you are. I'm no worse than the demons of this world. Besides, who cares? You can get your princess back and safe. She'll be yours, always 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 yours. I can't trap Luffy in that world, Uda responded. Shadows shivered within the mirror, swirling lightly. Freedom is everything to her. I won't hurt her, I won't. Yet part of her wanted it so badly, and it sickened her that she felt so possessive. If you'd rather leave her at the mercy of this hateful world, be my guest. How many CP0 do you suppose have tried to kill her by now? Dozens? Hundreds? That government and that throne will never stop trying to kill her, until they're all taken in hand. Nasuya rolled up in Uda's chest, and she bolted to the bathroom to throw up violently. That crackling laugh echoed in her ears again, but when Gordon came to find her out of concern, Uda couldn't bring herself to say anything. Deep in the dream world, taut musica cackled, swirling in the darkness of its cage. The host was so close to breaking. It would only take a little more pushing, with the right circumstances, and she would sing the awakening hymn herself. It wouldn't even have to brainwash her this time. Dear, foolish Emu would create the circumstances himself. The only problem was that girl. The light that comforted his damned host and kept her together, weakened Tot Musica's hold on her. But that emperor has finally damaged that lifeline. The time was close, so close. Maybe not before the wedding. But afterward, there was no chance. Its song would fill the world again. I'll be seeing you again soon, Nika. I can't wait. Chapter 10. Nami. 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 Wake up, I have a date today. Nami growled incoherently, swatting at the blurry form of her troublesome captain. 10 more minutes, she grumbled as her mind sluggishly ground to something resembling alertness. It's. Glancing at the window caused her to glower even more fiercely at Luffy's shape. The damn sun isn't even up yet, Luffy. What the hell? Usually she has to drag this girl out of her hammock to make her wake up late in the morning. But I've never been on a date before, Luffy protested cluelessly, not getting the hint because why would she? I need to get ready. You want to be ready? How about you get some sleep so you aren't exhausted the entire time? Nami retorted, then rolled over and buried her face in the pillow to make her point. Trafi, Nami's being mean. Nami vaguely heard an incoherent grumble from the sleeping form of the surgeon, who's crashed on the couch hastily pulled out in the far right corner of the room. Oh no, don't you dare complain to him, she protested, her voice muffled into incoherence. Luffy didn't need more enabling by her love-struck suitors. Trafi. She heard a sound that vaguely sounded like a hand clamping over a mouth. Luffy. Trafalgar grumbled, pure death in his voice. If you don't go back to sleep, and by doing so allow me to get what little real sleep I'm going to get on this hell island, I'm going to sedate you. Mean, Luffy pouted. Nami just sighed in relief. Law mercifully retained some of his sensible side after being ensared by her captain. What would she do without him? May he never end their alliance, even after they destroy Kaido. She needs him here, Sanji. Sedate her, Nami hissed frantically, her head snapping up instantly. Thankfully she could see Law grab Luffy and pull her down to his level before she could wake the blonde up, hissing something in her ear. Whether he was just reiterating his threat, telling her that Sanji needed some decent sleep after the stress of his abduction and being threatened by Judge, or was declaring his love just to confuse her long enough to stick a needle in her, it seemed to work. Luffy nodded slowly and a moment later slumped down on top of him to go to sleep on the spot. Law's flailing in attempts to move her, completely hampered by his sleepy state, came to precisely nothing. Nami snickered a little, then planted her head in the pillow and shut her eyes. She fell back asleep mere moments later. A few hours later, the orange-haired navigator woke up feeling utterly refreshed with the sunlight streaming through the window curtains. Sitting up and stretching, Nami looked around the room and saw that indeed, Luffy had fallen asleep on Law, and he hadn't tried too hard to dislodge her. She sprawled halfway across his chest, her head resting against his collarbone with her legs dangling off the side of the couch. Nami smiled softly at the sight. It's unexpectedly cute. It isn't obvious at first sight, but Nami could see Law's eyelashes fluttering. He's awake, but pretending not to be so he could enjoy their closeness. His left arm was resting comfortably around her waist. Now, Nami had her fingers in several betting pots involving her ridiculous captain, so she's loath to interrupt this moment. However, Sanji is sleeping against the wall on the opposite side of the room, and Nami refused to be stuck between them when he woke up and found his sunshine resting in the arms of tattooed bastard. Nope. She's dealt with that enough already, thank you. Good thing he hadn't been there when they defeated Mingo. Luffy, she murmured, walking over and gently shaking the girl by the shoulder. Luffy, wake up. Luffy grumbled in complaint and buried her face deeper in Law's chest. Of course now that Nami was awake at an actually civilized hour, she'd done a 180 and decided that her date was less important than sleeping in. Luffy, get up. Didn't you want to get ready for your date? Law's eyes flickered half open, giving her a disapproving look. Nami merely arched an eyebrow at him, unfazed. If he dislikes the idea of her marrying so much, he should just propose to her first. Luffy mumbled something incoherent, starting to stir a little. Unfortunately, it seemed Nami hadn't quite pitched her voice low enough. Or maybe just voicing the fact that Luffy was going on a date had triggered Sanji's sunshine alarm, because the blonde woke up instantly, clapped eyes on the tableau of Law and Luffy, and reacted. Predictably. What are you doing with my sunshine, shitty surgeon? Nami didn't think, she just dove out of the way. Luffy was jolted awake by the yell and flopped down to the ground with a startled squeak. Law vaulted upright, grabbing Kikoku and half-drawing it so Sanji's black foot clanged against the cursed blade instead of hitting him. Mind your own damn business, Cook, Law retorted with equal, if quieter, fierceness before shoving Sanji back. The blonde very maturely responded by launching half a dozen follow-up kicks, all of which Law blocked upon standing up. Chopper and Carrot, who had been sleeping peacefully up until that very moment, shot to their feet with alarmed cries. Brook snapped awake, but as soon as he saw the familiar scene he shrugged and relaxed. The traitor, Pedro, had half-drawn his sword, assuming it was the result of an intruder, but now was looking flabbergasted at the scene, clearly unsure what to do. Don't you morons dare break this room, Nami yelled, scrambling to her feet and grabbing her Klimatak. I'm not paying another repair bill. Guys, no fighting, Luffy agreed, sitting up against the wall and watching the mini-battle with a familiar confused expression that makes Nami kind of want to smack her. Her denseness is not very charming in this situation. Luffy stretched out her arms and tried to grab onto her squabbling suitor, only to yip in surprised pain when she got hit with armament hockey. Like magic, both men froze mid-fight and pivoted toward her. Sunshine, Sanji cried in concern when he saw her rubbing her wrist and wincing. OWW. Luffy complained, some Chopper to her side like a demon responding to a ritual. The reindeer doctor hurriedly examined her and then nailed both Sanji and Law with a genuinely intimidating death glare. Law slowly sheathed Kikoku while Sanji melted to the floor. What the heck was that about? Hold still, Luffy, Chopper said chidingly, grabbing her arm and examining it. He was relatively certain that she hadn't broken anything. Sanji and Law hadn't been seriously trying to kill each other, after all. But he always wanted to be sure, kept a close eye on her ever since he first heard about the Phantom Pain episodes. Seriously? Luffy complained, looking between the twosome in bewilderment. Sanji and Zoro have always been fighting for some reason. Nami's fingers twitched. But why are you fighting with Trafi? He was taking advantage of you, Sanji protested weakly. Eh, by being my pillow? Luffy asked in confusion. He's a very nice pillow. Sanji crashed to the ground in a state of despair, while Law resisted the urge to grin smugly. Sanji? Sanji? She reached over and poked his head. Ignore him, Luffy, Nami said, rubbing the bridge of her nose. Chopper, is she bruised or anything? Because I need to get this disaster into a decent date ensemble. She's okay, Chopper confirmed, before giving the twosome another dirty look. This one is somewhat undermined by his natural cuteness. And Law tried not to laugh or break out a protest about the other doctor being entirely too adorable. But thanks to those two. Come on, Sanji. Zoro is all the way in Wano, he scolded. Sanji recovered at the mention of his original rival, the fire back in his eyes. I'm only guarding my captain's virtue. I think she's more than capable of handling that herself, Law deadpanned, because he knows that if anyone tried anything ugly with Luffy, he wouldn't get the chance to cut the bastard into ribbons before the ReynaAtTheEnd broke the ground with. I like Sanji's fretting, Luffy said, because she could just never pick a side, could she? It's kinda reassuring. And really funny, Sanji looked like he couldn't decide how to feel about that statement. Nami grabbed her by her free hand and hauled her toward the bathroom, muttering under her breath. Carrot, be a dear and bring my trunk with me. Boys. I was under the impression that you were planning to start shadowing Reiju. This is probably a good time to get started on that. It wasn't phrased as an order, but Law couldn't help but bristle a little anyway. The attempt at dismissal was obvious. Though thinking about Luffy's pained yip when they accidentally hit her buried that feeling almost instantly. Right. He turned briskly on his heel and walked over to the wardrobe, digging out his disguise outfit. "Where are we likely to find her in the mornings, Sanji?" "How would I know?" Sanji protested, before sighing. "At the castle, most likely. At least it's the best place to start looking." "Shouldn't you be spending today with Pudding, Sanji?" Luffy's voice drifted from the bathroom door, a surprisingly hesitant tone in his voice. Nevertheless, the blonde froze up. Indeed, he'd almost forgotten about his bride to be in the rush of being reunited with his captain and crew. Could he gently break it off with Pudding now? That bastard judge couldn't force his compliance anymore, not with Sabo having come to his rescue. He wouldn't hurt her by saying wedding vows with his voice but not his heart. But Big Mom would not take the rejection kindly, would probably get violent. They would likely need a full-on escape plan before he dared to do such a thing. But that felt so wrong. No proper gentleman would string a lady along, much less one as kind and considerate as Pudding is. The reminder felt like a bucket of ice water being dumped on his head. Sanji nodded jerkily, murmuring, "I'll give you a map of the insides of Germa Castle, Law. Be careful not to be seen. Judge will be in a violent temper after what Luffy did." "I know how to sneak around, Sanji." Law scoffed, sliding into his long coat, "but I would appreciate that map." "What about us?" Chopper wondered. "I feel uncomfortable hanging around not contributing anything." "We," Brook said lightly, strumming his guitar, "are going to start scoping out the location of Totland's poneglyph, of course." Right. Chopper nodded confidently. Then Brook's words sank in all the way and he all but leapt out of his fur. "What?" Luffy's laughter from the other side of the door didn't make him feel any better. Reiju couldn't remember the last time she'd enjoyed herself. Her father had moved to take advantage of the world government's weakened state to attempt to make his vision a reality, sending her and her brothers from one island to the next in brutal conquest. Even though she'd long learned how to interpret his orders to her in the least monstrous way possible, it had been the longest and most bitter 2 years of her life. She could still see puddles of blood shivering under her boots as she walked across each battlefield. All the lives her father was ending chasing the past. Not every life they ended was that of a doe-eyed innocent, but who was judged to decide who deserved to live or die, him and his monstrous ego. That numbing feeling of self-loathing she experienced when she looked in the mirror. Every day her miserable existence dragged on. Reiju couldn't see a single part of herself worth saving. She couldn't even kill herself. Not long after her mother died and he realized what she had done, Judge had commanded her at the age of 8 that she was not to end her own life. He'd gone into specifics on this topic, cutting off medicine or being deliberately careless on the battlefield. Ironically, Reiju hadn't had any serious death thoughts until she was in her teens. At the time, he'd only creeped her out. It was when she'd first truly understood the power he wielded over her. Her only comfort was subtly following her little brother's journey across the sea. When she'd first heard that Sanji had joined a pirate crew, she'd smiled, hoping that he'd found his nakama, the family that he deserved. She'd worried when Judge demanded that the government capture Sanji and drag him home, and laughed heartily at the poorly drawn wanted poster that ended up protecting him from that man's clutches for the next 2 years. She was so proud of his accomplishments. Enies Lobby, Thriller Bark, Fishman Island, and Dressrosa. "Sanji, you've become so strong." When Big Mom's men had dragged him back to Germa, Reiju's heart had ached. And she'd started plotting, as much as she was able, on some way to help him escape from Totland so he could go back to his real home. Judge had no idea of her enmity to him. As far as he knew, she was nothing but his obedient, useful weapon. Her mask truly has been perfected. Or else Judge would have known how much she wanted to gouge his eyes out when he ordered her to put the explosive slave collars on Sanji's wrists. She'd only been able to wriggle into grabbing a dud set. And she'd still felt a painful jolt of grief when she'd locked them in place and seen Sanji's expression. And then his captain had shown up. Reiju hadn't known what to expect from her, but from the moment she delivered the righteous pummeling on Judge on Sanji's behalf that she'd so desperately wished she could do, the pink-haired woman thought she might be a little in love with her. So now Reiju is genuinely smiling, enjoying a nice slice of cake and discreetly observing Monkey D. Luffy gleefully devouring a plate full of treats while trying to get her massive fiancé to join in on her binge eating. She's a bit of a voyeur, she'll admit, But Luffy didn't seem to care about how all the other patrons of the cafe were badly pretending not to watch her and Katakuri on their date. They're an odd pair, visually at least. Katakuri was massive compared to Luffy, and he was so serious that her cheerfulness, enthusiasm and childlike wonder shone all the more brightly by proximity. She devoured her treats in a rush, wanting two of everything on the menu, while Katakuri was hardly touching his food, and the conversation between them. "So how did you beat the bad bastard? Tell me. You fought against that light-throwing bastard? Did you beat him up?" Kaido has an angel on his crew. What do you mean? He's got big wings and can conjure fire even though Ace is the fire fruit. Of course he's an angel. Luffy was begging Katakuri for stories about his previous battles, and Katakuri was slowly giving more than two-sentence answers to her as she kept bombarding him with requests. Patrons whispered that they didn't often hear him speak this much in public. Honestly, it was rather adorable. Reiju envied Katakuri for having the chance to marry such human sunshine. She could see him subtly gravitating towards her as she chattered at him, trying to give him sweets regardless of how many times he turned her down. He hadn't eaten anything yet, she noticed. He'd been drinking a milkshake through a straw, but that was it. Perhaps he simply wanted to spoil her, but it strikes her as a little odd. There's a slight clamor in the kitchen. If Reiju wasn't trained to notice such things, it would have been swallowed up by the general chatter in the store. The pinkette glanced at the counter, then casually stood up and walked over like she intended to buy something else. Leaning on the wall, she listened for the source. "Can't serve this over the counter. Please, Miss Flamp. What if some of the other guests eat one?" A cook was protesting, fear in his voice. "Just do it," a young girl snarled, her voice a mixture of spoiled arrogance and threatening rage. "If that happens, just call a doctor to tend to our people." The cook audibly quailed, a dozen apologies on his lips as he scrambled to do as she wished. Reiju's brow furrowed, and she peered around the corner into the kitchen through the window. There were a couple of young glowering at one of the cooking stations. The cook at it shakily accepted a vial from them and added it to his mixing bowls. "Ah. I see that not all of Katakuri's siblings are pleased that he's finally marrying." The princess recognized all kinds of poisons, from the natural to the exotic creations of man. How cruel of those children, to have no concern about a full batch of poisoned cakes being presented to their unsuspecting guests. Perhaps they thought Luffy would snatch the entire tray as soon as it was offered. Not an unlikely possibility, granted. But it was also clear that Charlotte Flamp didn't care who else got hurt as long as she got her target. Not to mention what Katakuri was likely to do to the hapless cook who got his fiancé poisoned. What to do about this? Reiju pondered. She could hardly allow Sanji's captain to get hurt, could she? I suppose I could buy them all myself when they hit the counter. Though eating that many cupcakes in one go would be a taller order for me than Miss Luffy. Or I'll just bump into the server on the way out of the kitchen. It would be a waste of some very tasty poison, but it would be safer than buying everything and still risking Luffy stealing a few of the offending treats off of her plate. She'd been doing that all morning, with the various victims too intimidated by Katakuri to complain about it. Reiju knew her father would have a coronary if she ever behaved like that at a meal. Perhaps that's why she found that brassy selfishness kind of adorable. Nodding to herself, Reiju sauntered over to the counter and ordered herself another drink. Then she sat down again and acted casual, one eye on the door to the kitchen. She'd mostly finished the milkshake, which was the healthiest thing she'd found on the menu. It should be noted that she heard the ding of the oven in question thanks to her enhanced hearing. Reiju waited a moment longer, then stood up and walked back to the wall, then acted confused. As soon as the server emerged with the platter from the kitchen, she took a hard right and walked directly into him. "Oof!" the boy yelped. Reiju had carefully aimed her elbow to hit his ribs. His knee-jerk response to the pain caused him to drop the platter, spilling the treats on the floor. "Oh dear, I'm so sorry," Reiju said sweetly to soothe the poor thing's nerves, kneeling to collect the dashed cupcakes. "I was looking for the bathroom. Here, let me help you." The frazzled boy scrambled to help, protesting that she was a guest and shouldn't have to clean up. Reiju gave him kind smiles and a gentle kiss on the cheek for his trouble. The strangled little noises of rage from the kitchen wasn't as tasty as the poison would have been, but it was close. She walked to the garbage and pointedly dropped the poisoned food within. Hopefully Sanji wouldn't be too displeased by her wasting food this way. Even unsafe confectionaries. But it was too bad she couldn't try at least one. Reiju insisted that the boy not be punished since it was her fault for bumping into him, then returned to her seat. She immediately felt Katakuri's gaze on her, and lifted her head to meet his eyes. His stern expression softened just a bit with gratitude, and a mixture of curiosity and puzzlement. She wasn't really given a chance to ponder it, though. Luffy swallowed her last treat and cheerfully waved at her. Reiji, you'll come spar with us again this afternoon, right? Father wants to have a war council, Reiju thought. Her body shivered, the instinctive need to grant that man's wishes like pins and needles. Well, he didn't give me a time for it, and he also told me to ingratiate myself to our soon-to-be-in-laws. I see no reason why this shouldn't count. Her muscles relaxed, and she resisted a triumphant smirk. I would love to, Luffy, she said, wondering at the last second if using her name was too familiar. Luffy beamed at her, dousing that worry immediately. It was a truly beautiful smile, warm as the rays of the life-giving sun. Reiju felt unworthy of it. In Wano. How much for them? Zoro had mixed feelings about the flower capital. On one hand, he could admit that the city itself was a thing of beauty, from the buildings to the sakura trees and the many artworks of the Wano people. On the other hand, the subtle signs of decadence, Shogun Orochi's work, were everywhere. Yakuza openly walked the streets, intimidating street vendors and causing the women to give them a wide berth. People would stumble out of bars completely sick from overeating while other areas of the land were starving, and the inhabitants was showing off their opulent wealth at every corner. Something Zoro usually had no use for. But when he'd walked past a jewelry shop at the edge of the district, doing his rounds to put himself in the minds of the locals as a wandering ronin who'd come to the flower capsule in search of work, something caught his eye. Luffy didn't wear jewelry. She didn't completely disdain the idea as he'd thought at first, but because everything but the most simple earrings tended to get in the way during fights. Either that or they were easily lost, or got in the way. That included most rings and necklaces. That was probably the only reason Sanji hadn't gifted her 2 stores worth of expensive gifts by now. What had caught Zoro's eyes weren't anything hugely opulent. It was a set of hairpins and a comb, studded with sapphires and tiny diamonds. Luffy had grown her hair out a little longer over the 2 years, and it tended to fall in her face during fights. Not that it ever seemed to interfere with her fighting abilities. She did complain about it, though. They'd be hidden mostly under her hat, if she liked them and decided to wear them. But after a moment of thought, Zoro decided that it didn't matter. He wanted to get something for her, and just her accepting them would be more than enough for her. Something that left his mark on his beautiful captain. He knew Luffy had left him a very important task, preparing for their war against Kaido. He still resented that he couldn't be there with her, watching over her, and keeping Katakuri from getting too close to her. It felt like giving her up without a fight. He loathed that feeling. You're calling her tomorrow, Zoro reminded himself, taking a calming breath as the shop owner examined the hairpins and comb. He had a decent amount of money on him. Falling back on his bounty hunting skills allowed him to bring in criminals for a good check. She won't miss a second call. You know what she's like. Always calling Ace every other week. His heart twisted, thinking about the newly minted emperor. How Luffy hadn't twigged to the fact he was madly in love with her, he couldn't figure out. A mixture of jealousy and respect for the man swirled in his stomach, and he shook his head hard to clear it. The quoted price the shopkeeper gave him the sense that he was being ripped off. But fuck it. He could afford it, and he's not supposed to draw attention to himself. Here, he said gruffly, tossing the heavy gold on the countertop. That should cover it. The 2 hairpins glistened in the sunlight when Zoro picked them up and turned them over in his hand. They were sharp enough to double as shivs. Not that he thought Luffy would think to use them that way. Probably. The comb was a bit more delicate. He put them away deep in his pocket and buttoned it closed, turning around and walking away. Part of him was leaning toward giving the gifts to Robin for safekeeping, just in case, but he didn't want to risk meeting up with Luffy and not having them on him. He wanted to give them to her himself, not have them passed along. That wouldn't convey the sentiment he wanted to express to her. Don't marry, Luffy. Zoro thought to himself as he walked. Local cutthroats were prowling after him. Excellent. He needed something to vent stress on. Wait for me. End chapter.